Thanks.
While you're sure. Alrighty. Oops. Welcome everybody. 6:31. This is a planning board workshop, so there'll be no official business tonight. From my understanding, we do have a guest to enlighten us on shoreland zoning, which we so badly need enlightenment on, believe me. So, Mr. Morse, would you be so kind?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I hope to enlighten somebody tonight. It might end up being myself. So hopefully we all learn a little something by the end of the evening. Yeah. First, thanks for inviting me down to meet with you guys tonight. And go over some shoreland zoning. I gotta say responsibilities for the planning board. It is geared primarily towards the planning board tonight, but there will be enough shoreland zoning talk going on that hopefully Board of Appeals members, selectmen, and other folks won't feel like they need to take a nap. But anyway, yes, my name is Mike Morse, and I'm the Assistant Shoreland Zoning Coordinator for the state. I cover the southern Maine region. It's 82 towns, last I checked, and it's about 45% of the state's population. We have two other staff. My supervisor, Colin Clark, works out of our Augusta regional office and covers around 100, 110, 20 towns, something like that, but they're obviously a little bit smaller. And then our Bangor staff person covers everything from above the Augusta region all the way up through to the county. So she's got, 280 towns or something, but it's a small percentage of the population. So anyway, we're very limited staff-wise at the DEP, but maybe through some of this process, some of this workshop tonight, it'll become more apparent, why we're three folks in the state that do shoreland zoning. The primary role or responsibility for administering and enforcing shoreland zoning is actually at the local level. It's not how we dreamt it up, it's how the legislature dreamt it up back in 1971. There was a big push for home rule authority and all that. But anyway, we won't get into all that tonight. So anyway, I do wish to say right at the start too that, we've got some ground to cover tonight, but I know you guys, or I anticipate you guys have some questions. So don't hesitate to, speak up or whatever. If I know we're going to be covering the topic shortly, then I'll just respectfully defer and just say we'll get to that if you don't mind. But anyway, plenty. This is an open session here. Feel free to chat as we go. And if you still have questions at the end that are unanswered, or you think you might want to contact me in the future, I've got my card here, and you can feel free to contact me. All right. Moving on. The first thing I'm going to just mention, because most of you guys are a planning board, or that's why we're here tonight, and it's because the planning board typically somehow adopts this function or inherits this function. It is the planning board, I suppose. And so that said, in 2015, the State of Maine Shoreland Zoning ordinance, or model ordinance, if you will, the Chapter 1000 guidelines were amended, which means that municipal ordinances are no longer consistent with these state minimum requirements. The Mandatory Shoreland Zoning Act, or the law, says, the state adopts these certain rules, these guidelines, and municipal ordinances have to be amended to be consistent with these rules. Ordinarily, the state would say, all right, towns, you have until such and such a date to adopt these changes. And then at that point, the state will initiate this state-imposed ordinance process, in which case we'll adopt the new ordinance for the town, which is kind of a pain in the neck for towns, because then you have your existing ordinance you have to administer and the new ordinance to administer, and there's going to be conflicts. So it's a nuisance for you guys, it's a nuisance for the code enforcement officer, the selectmen, Board of Appeals, landowners, the regulated community, to try to understand what's going on. However, with this round of changes, a former commissioner just made the decision well, we'll say the changes are mandatory, but we're not gonna put a drop dead date, if you will, on towns, in which time they have to adopt these changes locally. So the changes are mandatory for towns to adopt, but we're not sure what date. There is no date. We are sure about that. There is no date at the moment. Our message to the town of Lebanon is you guys have until the 2015 guidelines came out, you had a consistent ordinance, a consistent map, because you did go through this process in 2006, which was the round of changes, the bigger round of changes prior to the 2015 changes. There's a conditional order for the map and the ordinance that we won't get into tonight unless that comes up. But that still has to be applied by the town. But our message tonight is, with regard to these changes, since it typically is a planning board function, it's not mandatory, there's no deadline, but we're encouraging towns to go ahead and make the changes. And I will say personally, stepping aside from my DEP role, it's my opinion that the changes are certainly not more restrictive. In many cases, they're approximately equal to in terms of restrictiveness. And in some cases, the new rules are actually a little less restrictive, so more beneficial for a landowner. Depending on how what the town's climate is, if you really want to be more restrictive, then that may not interest you to push forward with the changes. However, if you choose to be a little, as less restrictive as you can get away with, then, it might be a good opportunity to start heading down that path and making the changes. But overall,
ours were amended for the 15.
They were. Has DEP reviewed this?
Haven't got a clue, but all our stuff says amended November of 15.
That was for like taking out, I can give you that.
But it was.
It went for legal and stuff, but it wasn't this.
It wasn't Shoreland?
It
was.
But
Okay.
I'll let you know.
All right.
But they missed, so the sections that were removed, they missed that, putting them back in during that revision, so that made some of the confusion.
Oh, okay.
So that, because I don't think that never made that draft that, we gotta get these back in. So
Right. Okay.
Does that, but again, I don't know
That
the
helps a
language
little
changes,
bit,
but I just know
This is a
that.
copy here. Do you mind if I
Yeah.
just take a quick look? Tell you fairly quickly if. Well, look at that. So some of the it looks like some of the major changes have already been made. So you might have already done that, and we may be at a point where either I'm forgetting that I've already reviewed it, or we haven't seen it yet. It's entirely possible. I'm getting older, and that was 2015.
But somebody may not have dropped the ball to notice, send it to you guys for review.
That certainly could be as well.
Yeah.
So, which is fine. So anyway, so we'll explore that a
we
little
have to
bit.
send it to you.
All right. So considering that, we'll assume that most of these changes are made, and we'll move on. All right. So we don't really need to talk about the amendment process. All right. So we'll jump into the permitting process. All right. So this is where a planning board has a certain role, certain function. Here's what we do: we review applications. DEP's approach, or our opinion, and that of many planning boards as well throughout the state is, we're going to provide a service to the town, not just review applications, bang, 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 we're done, have a nice day. Planning board members should be more familiar with the ordinance, more familiar with the process than the general public, than the regulated community. So our suggestion is, try to provide assistance to folks that are looking to do a project. Whether it's on the street, you see somebody at the corner store, or they come into your meeting. Preferably they come into your meeting and you have your ordinance in front of you. try to provide them some guidance. If you're not exactly sure, then don't say, "Oh, you don't need a permit for that." Just say, "Well, I don't think so, but here's who you got to talk to." But try to provide whatever assistance you can, and do so not for these kind of, we say, abstract hypotheticals. You know, so suppose somebody wanted to have a circus. But let's talk. What's your project? You can get wrapped around the axle all day long or all night long dealing with, what if somebody did this? All right, so what is it you want to do? And usually you get a half decent response from folks and you can move on. Similarly, if you guys have questions, one of my roles, one of DEP's roles is to provide assistance to municipal officials, okay, and the regulated community to a degree. But code enforcement officers, board of selectmen, board of appeals members, and planning board members, of course, too. As an application comes in the door, gee, how do we treat this one? This one's a little unique. Here's what the ordinance says. Here's what that standard says. How do we handle this? That's where DEP hopefully can provide some assistance. This is all I do for work. All right, shoreland zoning's, fairly complicated. It's 70 some odd pages or whatever it is. Code enforcement officers are responsible for, like 8 different disciplines: building code, energy code, shoreland zoning, floodplain, life safety code, fire, whatever. They can't know everything about everything. And I'd like to think I know everything about shoreland zoning. And you're going to call me tomorrow with a question, I'm going to be stumped. All right, but I can find the answer. If it's something unique, the three of us will run it by each other. Hey, if you run into this before, you run into that. Or if it really boils down to a legal interpretation of our language, we can go to the Attorney General's office for an opinion as well. We did that recently on a case here in town, a violation. So anyway, feel free to contact me. I'm your representative, if you will, for the DEP regarding shoreland zoning. So feel free to contact me. Provide assistance, basic intro to shoreland zoning. You don't need to sit down and do what we're doing tonight. You don't need to sit down and go over the whole ordinance, but try to provide that assistance. Enough on that. The story behind this. This is where it's helpful for CEOs, planning board members, board of appeals members that are talking to the regulated community can help set the record straight. Here as well, rare waterfront lots, only 75-foot setback, being advertised instead of the 250-foot setback, like most. Well, it's not like most. There are properties where there is a 250-foot setback, but it's, if you look at the town zoning map, it's typically not the vast majority of the shoreland zone. It's usually a small percentage. The backstory here is, fortunately, this is not in Maine, but as it's been explained over the years, this is a case where horse farmer wanted to build a structure of some type of lean-to or whatever for providing shade for the horses. No, sir, I'm sorry, the zoning ordinance prohibits that. Well, what about furniture? Can I have tables and chairs? Sure. Well, this is what they ended up building. Tables and chairs. It doesn't usually work out that well for the landowner, but sometimes spending a little bit more time up front and trying to work out a solution. What can be done? Can something be given a permit? Or in a different location on the property, or can they receive a variance from the Board of Appeals? Is it legitimate for a Board of Appeals to grant a variance for that sort of thing? But kind of front-loading that information can help avoid, these sorts of things, and then misrepresentations. Of course, folks will still advertise however they want to advertise to sell a property. But all right, permitting decisions. Rule number 1, applications must show conformance to the standards. All right, what if they don't show conformance to the standards? What do you do as a planning board? You get an application, you review it before you go into the planning board meeting, and you know they missed this, they missed this, and they missed this.
Bounce it back.
Bounce it back, how so? Just
Explaining to them what's missing, if we know exactly what they're doing.
sure. So there's several ways to do that. It's a very good answer. One would be to bounce it back and just flat out reject it. You know, we're here at 7 o'clock, we start our meeting, viewing this application. Planning board chair, it's incomplete, but we reject it. All in favor? Done. Since, you know, that's one way to do it. Technically, you could do it that way. However, you might also just bounce it off and say, hey, look, you know, here are the deficiencies. Do you want to talk about it now? Do you want to provide a little more information to the board so we can move this forward? If it looks like it could be an approvable project, but it's just the application's missing some information, well, maybe they can just submit something or provide something right there during the meeting. Or you can say, hey, look, you're missing an awful lot. You missed your site plan that you need to have a surveyor provide for you. You're missing this and this and this. We can discuss it for now and just give you a sense, but you're going to have to come back. You know, let's reschedule it. So there are a couple different ways to do it. Regardless, you need to require additional information from the applicant. And then moving forward, if they insist we've got to do something with this today, or the project just won't conform to the standards, then you have to deny the application. What do you always do? You always write up some findings of fact. You've got to have a document that not only says you're denied or approved, you've got to have some basis for that. You've got to demonstrate, list the standards out. Do you meet this standard? Vote, yes. Next standard, yes. Next standard, yes. That's how a lot of planning boards will do it. That way, at the end of the day, particularly with a denial that might get appealed, you've at least documented why you've made the decision you made. And that is extremely critical. If something gets appealed to the Board of Appeals or eventually to a court, a judge is going to say, well, what was the basis for this decision? What are your findings of fact? Oh, well, we didn't write them up. We just had a conversation, and here's the slip of paper where we said denied. It's almost always sent right back to the planning board or to the Board of Appeals. So, you know, let's go back to square one, get this documentation. And what's the problem with that? Time and money. All right, the town is expending money on the town attorney when something's going to court. So just be careful with that and try to document everything. We'll move forward from there. And just another important note that we tend to see, sometimes an applicant will come in, get their planning board approval, get the CEO permit, and then they'll turn around and apply to DEP for their DEP permit, or they just change the project, or through the DEP's process, the project has to be changed for stormwater management reasons or some other reason, avoiding a wetland or a stream or something. I don't do that permitting at DEP, it's a whole separate set of regulations. But anyway, regardless, the project changes. The applicant, the person that received the permit should be coming back to the planning board with seeking a plan modification approval. If you approved A and now they're doing B, they have to come back and get some type of amendment. And that's oftentimes overlooked. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Maybe put a condition on the approval saying project changes in any way, shape, or form. You got to come back and see us. All you need to do is likely all you need to do, and it may turn into a legal question, but it should be just a review of the minor change, rather than, all right, let's start all over again. It should be just here's what changed. Okay, yeah, this is approvable or it's not. So.
Excuse me.
Yes.
There's a 35-day limit in there, I was reading today, from the time that the application is considered complete and the time that we have to take action on it.
Yes.
How strict is that criteria?
Good question. So that's more municipal law than it is shoreland zoning. So I'm sort of gonna punt to the town attorney on that one, but except to say that it is I'm gonna say a fairly or very firm deadline from the date it gets the application comes in the door, it gets date stamped, or somebody jots down the date and time that rolls in the town office. It should be 35 days, within that period that the planning board hears the application or acts on it. There are extenuating circumstances. We don't have a quorum. So and so is in Bermuda this week, and so is sick in the hospital with pneumonia, or whatever extenuating circumstances are. You might not have a quorum, and then there's some municipal law in there somewhere that gives the planning board or a CEO, if it's a CEO review, or a board of appeals, it gives you guys the ability to somehow put it on hold or delay it or continue it for another meeting or something. Be a good municipal law question for your town attorney.
The date received, is that for a completed application? So if they're missing stuff, or is that then available? Because again, if you have an application that says it's supposed to have this, and this, and they don't,
right,
then can't I just give it back to them and say it's not complete, and therefore I don't have to take receipt of it?
What I read today it says complete application.
I'm not reading out of the town's ordinance. I'm just reading out of Chapter 1000 guidelines. It's probably similar to the town's ordinance. Procedure for administering permits within 35 days of the date of receiving a written application. The planning board or code enforcement officer shall notify the applicant in writing either that the application is a complete application or if the application is incomplete, that specified additional material is needed to make the application complete. The planning board or the CEO, as appropriate, shall approve of the conditions or deny all permit applications in writing within 35 days of receiving a completed application. Completed application. So I would suggest that if the Lebanon Planning Board says, we want to have a chance to do a completeness review, somehow you build that in as a policy of the planning board or of the town. I don't know that it has to be in the ordinance, but okay, meeting number one is a completeness review. Or maybe you've reviewed it individually going into the meeting, and the first thing you vote on is the application complete? That's the most common method. But have some written policy or something for the planning board for procedures, if you feel like you need to. But I would say, if you think you're going to take the first meeting to do a completeness review and then come back the next month or 2 weeks later for the next meeting, that probably ought to be a written policy. But if you're going to just do a completeness review vote at the very first meeting you have after you receive the application, I don't know that you need to write up a policy for that.
Because we do meet monthly, so I mean, you're pushing like 35 days.
Right. And it's tough. But again, if you're, so if you meet every month, that's why they have the 35-day limit there.
But they have a planning board clerk, so could the clerk perhaps look through it to see that all the information is there, or is that really a board thing?
The planning board or CEO shall notify the applicant in writing either that the application is a complete application, or if the application is incomplete, that specified additional material. So it doesn't say the planning board or CEO or its designee. It says planning board or the CEO. So I think technically it's saying planning board would do that review. I'm thinking Brunswick and Portland and some of the bigger communities have said, we're going to have this application staff review committee, and they write it right into the ordinance. They have this function, then the planning board has that function. So you could do something like that, and DEP should be able to approve that. So, good questions, but if you ever find yourself up against the wall with you have a snowstorm and your meeting's canceled and you know you're going to go over the 35 days, don't call me, call your town attorney. Or you can call me and I'll tell you to call the town attorney. But I really think there is something in there for extenuating circumstances that buys you a little more time. It might take, well, anyway, I'm not even going to speculate. All right, so there are basic review standards right in the town's ordinance. And I have them listed here and on the next page, and we're not going to go through all these in detail. But ultimately, these are the sorts of things you're going to want to have listed in your decision. Maybe you have a template decision already typed in. Maybe somebody's got a laptop and you're doing it all electronically right there, or maybe you're doing it by hand. But either way, you ought to have that list right there. All right, let's vote on this one. Will the project maintain safe and healthful conditions? Don't ask me what all that means. All right, I think what that means is in Limerick a few years ago there was a propane plant, propane cylinder storage plant proposed in a residential neighborhood. Just so happens Limerick didn't have zoning outside of the shoreland zone. And this property for the plant literally was like 251 feet away from the water. Shoreland zone being 250 feet. So they had no jurisdiction. But planning board here in Lebanon, well, would that have maintained a safe and healthful condition? All the neighbors down the street and in that area. What if this thing explodes? What if it catches fire? What if there's a leak? We're not going to be able to get to our homes, or we're not going to be able to get out of our homes. I don't know. I'm not saying all propane storage tanks are bad, but that's just an example. Will not result in water pollution, erosion, or sedimentation of surface waters. Do they provide an erosion control plan that's sufficient in their application? They're required to in their CEO application, in their planning board applications. They have to demonstrate that they're not going to have erosion into the water or onto somebody else's land. What's that? It's an erosion control plan. All right, and we won't get into all of these, but let's vote on this one. Let's make a finding right there. Let's vote and make a finding. Yes or no? It can be, I think, that simple. Although if it's a no, just be sure that you maybe substantiate why it was a no. We had concerns about this, or our finding is that this is not adequately taking care of this problem or that problem. But these are some of the standards. The rest of them are right here. It's 9 of them. This last one we're going to focus on a little bit more. So that last one says it's the project's in conformance with the provisions of Section 15 land use standards. Okay, Section 15 is in our Chapter 1000 guidelines. That's where you have all the standards for principal and accessory structures, individual private campsites, piers, docks, wharves, and other structures extending over the water body, parking areas, roads and driveways, timber harvesting, essential services, septic systems, clearing for vegetation for other activities other than timber harvesting, water quality, erosion control, all these different standards of sections with standards in them. So what do we mean by that? It means the planning board would need to consider all those standards. So if somebody's coming to you applying for a boat launch, all right, that's not fair. A project, let's say, some type of commercial project, all right, and it's a commercial use allowed in that particular zone. Then in that case, if it's an office products retailer, not a gas station with petroleum, but let's just say office product retailer. Do you need to look at the agriculture standards? No. Do you need to look at timber harvest standards? No. You don't have to look at everything, but you need to look at the standards relevant. The erosion control standards. Look at the erosion control plan that's submitted. The principal and accessory structure standards. You need to know whether the project complies with that. Does it meet the shoreline setback? What about lot coverage? The amount of non-vegetated surface within a shoreline zone. All right, these are all standards right in there. We'll talk a little bit more about what these are, some of these standards are in a few minutes. But there are a number of standards. You're going to look at the parking lot standards, the parking facility. does that meet the minimum setback from the shoreline or from the upland edge of the wetland? Roads, driveways, and all that. So, but you look at those, you need, when you're looking at this finding, there's a lot more to it than some of these others, okay, than some of the other that make up those 9 standards, the other 8. And hopefully the applicant's done a thorough job putting their application together and gone through each one of these sections of the ordinance and these standards and documented why they demonstrated why they feel the project conforms. So anyway, consider only the relevant standards. Again, for an office supply place, you don't need to look at agriculture or timber harvesting. Is revegetation necessary? In some cases, excessive removal of vegetation in excess of the standards is allowed in certain cases, but revegetation is required. Okay, those standards should be in there, and those standards might actually be in your new ordinance. We'll have to look at that. If it's a new lot, does it conform to the minimum lot size requirements in section 15A of the ordinance? 40,000 square feet for a residential use, 60,000 square feet for commercial or industrial use, 200 feet of frontage, 300 feet of frontage depending on the use. Does the project meet the setbacks, lot coverage, etc.? I've already mentioned. Oh. What do you do if a project meets the standards in the ordinance? You approve it. What if you just, in your gut, your personal feeling is, we don't need this in town? What about what are those pornography shops or whatever they call them? You know, adult business or something where they sell that stuff. What about that? You know, that sort of project. The cell phone towers for a number of years. You know, raise the ire of a lot of folks. What if you don't like the project, but they meet the standards? You gotta approve it. That's exactly right. We don't have a choice. You know, you almost have to check your personal feelings at the door when you come in and do this job. Same with Board of Appeals. It's the same thing. There are sets of rules to follow, and you're sworn to follow the rules, regardless of what your personal feelings are. And that's very tough sometimes, particularly when you're looking at denying a project because it doesn't meet a standard, and you think, gee, this guy just wants to, you know, open a new business, or he wants to put his house here, or he just wants to subdivide his land, and, you know, it's his land, why can't he do this sort of thing? Well, we have to check that at the door. Again, going back to a comment I made earlier, if there's a way to do the project that you see that would conform, and it's just a different way to do the project, well, feel free to offer that to them. You don't have to hide that from them. Okay, that's something that's good customer service. Unless you really don't like the project, then you don't need to feel obligated to pass that information on. So anyway, if it meets the standards, you got to approve it, and if it doesn't meet the standards, you have to deny it. All right, DEP provides technical assistance, as I mentioned earlier, to towns across the state, cities and towns. We can help interpret. We can interpret our language, which vast majority of towns have adopted essentially this document. If you tweak the language some and you say, we want it to say it this way, we probably cannot provide a legal opinion on what, or a legal interpretation of your unique language. The AG's office has said to us, don't you ever do that. If their language is different, they've got to work it out with their own town attorney if they need to. But we can provide assistance on interpretations all day long of the state model language that's probably in your ordinance. We can do field site visits. We can do site walks for planning boards if necessary. We'll have a conversation on the phone first. Again, we're 3 of us and with 450 some odd municipalities in the state, so we can't do that on every application. But you know, if you need a hand on the first couple applications for a relocation of a structure or something like that, which we'll talk about a little more, I'm happy to come down if it can work out. Anyway, or if we can talk about it on the phone, here's what we saw during our site walk. We can do all that stuff. We can help with determining whether an application is complete. We can offer written opinions, referencing the local ordinance, again, assuming the language in the local ordinance is consistent with our state standards. We can talk about complex projects or enforcement actions or violations, which doesn't happen very often in Lebanon. Or won't here in a little bit, hopefully. All right, so let's talk about some of the standards that you're looking at. I mentioned this lot coverage standard. So this is all it's all structures, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's all non-vegetated surfaces. Generally speaking, it's 20% of the lot area within the shoreland zone. All right, these shoreland zoning standards ignore the rest of the world. Okay, so if we're looking at a project in the shoreland zone, you're ignoring anything else out there. Okay, you're looking at everything within 250 feet of a lake, 250 feet of a freshwater wetland, 250 feet of a river, whatever you have for regulated resources, 75 feet from a regulated stream. It doesn't matter that they have 5,000 acres outside of the shoreland zone. They're trying to stay within this 20% limit. If they only have 10,000 square feet in the shoreland zone, you have to ignore their 5,000 acres outside of the shoreland zone. You have to look at that lot area within the shoreline zone. But again, most cases it's 20%. There are certain areas in general development districts. I'm not sure if we have those in Lebanon, maybe not. If you do, then it's typically elevated to 70%. And it's recognizing existing development is usually fairly significant and all the rest. The CFMA is just Commercial Fisheries Maritime Activities District, which you don't have. It's a coastal thing. General Development District is a GD. And what do we mean by non-vegetated surfaces? Well, you have this. You have structures, portable, temporary, I don't care what you want to call them. They're all regulated under shoreline zoning. You have the house over here. You have the bunkhouse over here. You have the garage over there, the tractor parking area. And what really pushed this one over the limit, some of this stuff is grandfathered, it's been there forever. What pushed this particular project over the limit was, well, we don't have enough, so we're going to do a little more over here. And that just pushed them over they were already well over the 20% lot coverage limit within the shoreland zone. I don't remember what percentage they were, and then they just created more. That was a problem there. But that's what we mean by non-vegetated surfaces or lot coverage. All right, let's just assume you guys have adopted the language in the 2015 guidelines. So we're going to ignore this left column. So we're talking about structures specifically, right in the ordinance very explicitly, structures, driveways, parking areas, and other areas from which vegetation was removed. There's a couple exemptions that we have built into the Chapter 1000 guidelines that if you haven't already considered them, you certainly could in another round of amendments. One is this naturally occurring ledge and rock outcroppings on lots existing on March 24th, 1990. That's just the date that the lot coverage standard first came into effect. That's why you have this, it's not just some random date, it's the date that the lot coverage first came into effect. And I'll show you a slide on what we're talking about here. Basically, there are some parcels out there, mostly on the coast, you'll see in the photo, where the lot has so much existing ledge or rock outcroppings already that a totally undisturbed site already is in excess of the 20% lot coverage or non-vegetated surface standard. So we built in this exemption where you can exempt these natural features so that it doesn't prohibit somebody building on an undeveloped lot in the shoreline zone because of the lot coverage. The other one is public boat launching facilities. The short story there is Fish and Wildlife or Department of Conservation or the town of Lebanon is given a piece of land to put a boat launch, or there's an interest in putting a boat launch, public boat access launch, on a given body of water, and it's the cheapest thing out there that you can afford, that you're able to buy, or it's given to you as a gift, and it ends up being this sliver of land the width of this room. with a little parking up in there. Well, you can't very well put in a 12-foot wide, 14-foot wide ramp down to the water, or road access down to the water, and then a ramp in the water without, on a lot this wide in the shoreline zone, without being probably 90% lot coverage right out of the block. So we built in this exemption for public boat launching facilities. Part of shoreline purpose of shoreline zoning is to provide access to water bodies, so people can enjoy the water bodies. So that was an obstacle for a few municipalities over the years, and also various state agencies trying to put in boat launches. It's optional. If you don't have it in there, it's optional for the town. You don't have to adopt that. No exemption for grass paver type products. Stay tuned. All right, naturally occurring ledge. This is what we mean. I don't know that you're going to find this in the town of Lebanon, so I'm not going to. But you know, picture this lot where this is the edge of the shoreline. Down in here, look at all this ledge here. You know, it's already well over the 20% lot coverage, even if a house had never been built. No development on the lot. Grass pavers. I mentioned that very quickly here as we passed on that last slide. This is why we don't have any exemption for grass pavers. These are these grid type products. Some of them are like a concrete type of product. Others are kind of more of a plasticky type product where it provides structural integrity for vehicles driving on it. Yet it's this open system that supposed to allow vegetation to grow, namely grass, up and through here. These are not exempt. Okay, we can encourage folks to use them. They've got to be better than asphalt or concrete or compacted gravel, but this is why they're not exempted. This is just what we're finding. These had all been planted and looking great at one point in time. Then you drive on them and look what happens. Or you go through a Maine winter and it's icy. Let's throw some salt down on the driveway. What does salt do to grass?
In concrete.
Yes, right. Very true. Very true. So we had a policy for a handful of years where we allowed some credit for grass paved driveways, but that's done. So you have the applicant coming in. You're gonna have the applicant coming in, and the reason they want to do this is because they want to expand their house, and they're already over 20% lot coverage. They're at 23%. And gee, if I can get 50% credit on this driveway or 100% credit, then that'll allow me to take that area and add it so I can do my addition onto the house if I can. Right? I appreciate that. You know, I'm a pretty conservative guy outside of DEP. All right, so I understand it, and I would try it too, but it just hasn't worked. So there is no more credit or policy there. All right. Speaking of roads and driveways, planning boards should be written into the ordinance. Planning boards have the authority to reduce the road or driveway setback when no reasonable alternative exists, but they can't reduce it to anything less than 50 feet from the shoreline. Okay, so if the setback is 75 feet from a freshwater wetland or 100 feet from a great pond, then if there really is no alternative out there for a particular applicant, they can't get a CEO permit for that. Okay, they go to the planning board. They could go to the Board of Appeals for a setback variance, but I would encourage them, instead of trying to get a variance, because that is a very difficult process, there's a standard built right in that gives the planning board the authority to waive that setback or reduce that setback down to, as long as it's no less than 50 feet from the shoreline. Now, it doesn't mean it's just an automatic, all right, we can just waive it down to 50 feet, here you go. I mean, if they can be 82 feet from the shoreline, that's what the town ought to require, the planning board ought to require. So it's setback as far as practical. But what do you run into? What would cause this sort of thing? A number of reasons. These are just the couple examples, the most common examples, I should say. Steep slopes, ledge outcropping that would require a lot of blasting just behind, this, the back part of the buffer area, the 100-foot buffer from a lake, for instance. They don't own that property. Yeah, we see that a fair amount. Our lot is just this postage stamp lot up here. We can't just go putting it back there on our neighbor's property. We've got to be 68 feet back from the water because we don't own back beyond 100 feet. That's probably the most common. Yeah, and setback compliance, meeting the 100-foot setback for a new driveway, for instance, would make them have to remove a garage or some other structure that they have on the property. We're not into that. You could maybe take that very rigid approach if that's your goal as a planning board, is to apply the standards the strictest way possible, but it's not DEP's goal. So from the state standpoint, you don't need to do that. I saw, yeah, never mind. It's too local. It's not Lebanon, but it's very close. I saw a relocation of a structure at one point with a driveway being pushed right back up to the front door of an accessory structure. And we're standing on site doing the site walk, and before I had a chance to get it out of my mouth, the landowner's contractor said, "How are they going to get into their building?" Well, they'll have to move that. Move the other building too? Anyway, it's a little excessive. It's possible you can be that rigid, but the town needs to make that decision. There are other circumstances, but limited, as I mentioned here. There are other circumstances where sometimes a road or an access way, a driveway, it's more a road, would be allowed to access the water body. There's a standard. I only bring this up because sometimes people apply for a boat launch on occasion, and I don't know if you'll run into that here in Lebanon by chance, but there's a standard in Chapter 1000 that says, so roads and driveways shall be set back at least 100 feet from these water bodies, 75 feet from those water bodies. And then there's a paragraph down below that says basically those standards do not apply to approaches to water crossings or to roads or driveways that provide access to permitted structures and facilities located near to the shoreline or tributary stream due to an operational necessity, excluding temporary docks for recreational use or uses. Okay, and then for those roads and driveways, you have to meet certain road and driveway standards. Your grade, so you're not going to create an erosion problem into the water body. But if you have a functionally water dependent use, let's use a commercial fisheries type situation in along the coast somewhere in Portland or Kittery or York or Wells or something. Excuse me. There are functionally water dependent uses. Commercial fishermen have to be able to have a road to get down to the shoreline to do whatever they do with commercial fishery stuff, move nets, traps, bait, their catch, whatever. So that's supporting a functionally water dependent use. The public boat launch. Fish and Wildlife comes to town and says, "Hey, we'd like to put in a public boat launch on this property we have on Northeast Pond." How can you let somebody put a road down there? Well, it's a functionally water dependent use. It's an operational necessity. You can't have the boat launch down in the water and then have trees backing your trailer up. So I thought I'd throw that out for you in case that ever comes up in Lebanon. Something to consider. All right. So I mentioned functionally water dependent uses. What do we mean by that? Well, this is clearly a functionally water dependent use. It's a dock to access boats, accessing the water. That dock serves no function back on land. So it's functionally water dependent. And since access to a water body is an allowed use, it's something that can be permitted by a town. Now, temporary, just as an aside, temporary docks can be permitted by the code enforcement officer. Permanent docks would be a permit from the planning board. Permanent docks or permanent structures in the water would be a planning board review, just because of the permanency. Note too that there are standards in there that basically say, or effectively say, you can't have a new permanent dock. Excuse me. there's something in there that says that does tie shoreland zoning to DEP's review under the Natural Resources Protection Act. Totally separate law. 99.9999% of the time has absolutely no bearing on what you do in your review. Now, let me be perfectly clear. DEP issues a permit by rule under the Natural Resources Protection Act, or issues a full permit or an individual permit or a tier wetland fill permit, any type of permit under any other DEP regulation. An applicant comes to you, I've already been to DEP, here's my permit, so go ahead and sign off on this for me. No, what are the town standards? Okay, remember those standards we looked at earlier, all those, the 9 general standards, but the last one being the one, does it meet all the specific standards for the project? You can't sign off on it because DEP gave permit under a whole different law. You have to review it under your own standards. The one exception really to this whole thing is there's for piers, docks, wharves, and other structures extending into the water or below the normal high water line, for permanent structures, there's a provision in the ordinance, or should be, that says something like, this is not valid unless DEP is issued a permit under the Natural Resources Protection Act for it. This is the one exception, okay? So if somebody's coming in with a permanent dock application in Spalding Pond or Northeast Pond or in the river, you can look at that, but ultimately it's not valid. You can't approve it if DEP has not issued a permit. But that is the only time, so just keep that in mind. Piers, docks, wharves, other structures, it's the only time you're looking for that DEP permit, meaning you've got to have it. Okay? It's good to know that they have a DEP permit for other projects, but it doesn't have, again, it doesn't have any bearing on what you guys are doing as a planning board or Board of Appeals. It's nice.
I found it, bottom of page 14.
Okay.
So it is there.
Yes, all right. That's good to know. It should be in there. It doesn't surprise me it's in there. All right. Moving right along here. Functionally water dependent. Yeah, this is commercial stuff in Portland. The only thing I want to point out here is recreational boat storage buildings, boat houses. This is not a Mike Morse opinion. This is not a DEP opinion. This is written into state law. We didn't dream this stuff up. It's in state law, put in there by our legislators back many years ago. I think it was sometime in the 80s. And I can tell you why. It had to do with development, residential development on one of the piers in Portland, Chandler's Wharf. But recreational boat storage buildings, by law, by definition in the law, by standard in the law, and by Chapter 1000 guidelines, it should be in your ordinance, but it doesn't have to be. Recreational boat houses are not functionally water dependent. Counterintuitive, I know. Okay, how many times have I had that conversation with everybody? Because remember what I said about a dock? It can't perform its purpose, its function, if it's not in the water. Well, you could say the same thing about a boathouse, except that in the law and in your ordinance and the rules, it clearly excludes boathouses from being water dependent. I think it boils down to the legislature saying, we don't want to see new structures like that on the water. If you have an existing boathouse, go ahead and continue to maintain it. Absolutely. If it's maintainable, doing basic repairs and maintenance, go for it. We encourage that. Because once you let it go, it's gone. So, but no new boathouses. If you see them, feel free to call me. And there can be some exceptions, and we'll talk about relocation of non-conforming structures in a little bit. So, again, boathouse, water dependent?
No.
That one clearly not, because it looks like it has living space upstairs, but this is more a traditional boathouse, so that's water dependent, right?
No.
We'll go back to that. All right, I would like to hear a resounding no.
No.
We don't have to.
No.
So boathouses are
That was
not
a
water
trick question.
Yes, exactly. All right. Shoreline stabilization. This is going to be something that you're going to see from time to time. It may not be huge in Lebanon, okay? It may or may not be. But you're not going to see this. This is coastal. This is what you're going to see on Northeast Pond, Spalding Pond, and on the river, okay? This is where, gee, all the boat traffic or the currents or the whatever is starting to erode my shoreline. Planning board can consider these shoreline stabilization projects as being functionally water dependent structures or uses. So they have to be there. They can't stabilize a shoreline if they're back 100 feet from the lake, right? So you're allowed to permit these things as shoreline stabilization structures or projects. But there are some standards you just need to be aware of related to this. And the big one I want to talk about tonight is, again, this is planning board review. Vegetation removal should be limited, all right? And I'll explain why. And then revegetation should be required, okay? So we do our project and then we revegetate. The reason I bring this up is this particular project here, this is in the mid-coast before these standards were put into place. This had a natural buffer that was probably kind of ugly, you know, native natural vegetation, scrubby, grown in really tightly, and this and that, covering the shoreline and blocking a view. All right. So hey, let's do this shoreline stabilization project. There actually was a consultant working up in engineering consultant up in the mid-coast area, recommending going around to landowners saying, "You want to have a view to England? You want to have $1 million view? Yeah, I'd love that. We'll do this $60,000 shoreline stabilization project. 60 grand for $1 million view? You know, here you go." And there was this day and age where they would do it and then not replant. Well, I mean, one of the standards, whether you agree or disagree, one of the standards for shoreline zoning, or one of the purposes, is to retain screening of the shoreline, or what's on the shoreline, from the water, when viewed from the water. So, while a nice view is great for us, I love a nice view to England, looking out off the coast. All right, I don't have that property, by the way. I work for the state, but it is beautiful. But and if you want that, then be sure to buy the property that has it, because even if you don't, and you go through and do a shoreline stabilization project, you're going to have to replant similar native species. And this is the sort of thing the planning board is going to be requiring for a revegetation plan in an application to do shoreline stabilization. Now, if they already had existing lawn down to the water to start with, and then it was just this eroding bluff or eroding slope, we're not suggesting that you need to require them to replant a dense forested buffer, so now they lose what they already had, you know, this grandfathered clearing. No, they'd have to replant grass, vegetation, to restabilize the soils, but they could have grass again. All right, it's just this was not the case originally, nor was this. This is on a lake, and what we're talking about revegetation here is there was some bunch of native shoreline vegetation here, trees, saplings, shrubs, other ground cover species growing fairly densely through here, and they knew they had to revegetate, so the contractor did the rock work, and then said, yeah, we'll do the replanting, and they brought in daylilies and some other, I don't know, marigolds or pansies or whatever, I don't know, flowers, ornamental stuff. That doesn't cut it. It's got to be, if they're removing native vegetation, sweet fern, other shrubs, bayberry on the coast, whatever, the trees, saplings, they should be required to replant. The replanting plan you're reviewing should have all that in there. All right, and there are standards, how, you know, densities and this and that. Well, we're not going to get buried into it tonight, but we'll talk a little bit about it in a few minutes. All right, so just keep in mind, shoreline stabilization's okay. We don't want to see people losing the land if they feel they've got to beautify it and stabilize it with rock. Vegetation can be better in some cases, but sometimes rock is better. If they remove a bunch of native vegetation, replanting plan. Just remember that. All right. And if the consultant or the contractor or the landowner says, we've never had to do this before, we don't have to do this in whatever town, here it is. Here it is in Lebanon. Welcome to our town. Yeah. And you know what? They have to do the same thing in the other town. All right. There is a provision also in state law, and it may or may not be in your ordinance. It's not very well or strongly worded in our Chapter 1000 guidelines, and I'm going to say for political purposes with our former commissioner. Thank heavens, former, but I'll leave it at that. She did not feel that we needed to add as a standard what is actually in state law and mandated under the law, which is any excavation contractor disturbing more than 1 cubic yard of soil within the shoreland zone shall be certified through DEP, by DEP, to do this work in the shoreland zone, be certified in erosion and sedimentation control best management practices. Why? Not because we're just trying to create a new program. We're not making all sorts of money on this. It's to ensure that they know about erosion control measures so that we're not going to continue to have contractors that are supposed to know better going out and creating a big discharge, a big plume of soil out into the lake tomorrow when it rains 1.5 inches or 2 inches, what they're saying. All right. So all contractors have to be certified. What do you do as a CEO? What do you do as a planning board? Put a certification number in a line, fill in the blank. What's your certification number, Mr. or Miss Contractor? All right. There are techniques. You look at the erosion control plan. I sound like a broken record here, but make sure there's an erosion control plan with these best management practices built into it. Erosion control mulch berms to prevent capture sediment that has started to run off, filter the rainwater. Erosion control mulch, a little handful of it. But anyway, request or better yet, require a certification number for all contractors. So your applicant comes, your landowner comes in the door. I've got this great project. Here's my erosion control plan. All right, who's your contractor? Well, I haven't decided yet. Well, we're going to put a condition on your approval. We can approve your project, but we're going to put a condition on it saying, you shall provide us the contractor's name, address, phone number, and
Certificate number.
Right. Prior to breaking ground. So anyway, and again, it may or may not be in your ordinance. If it's not, it's still a requirement under the state law that towns require this. So it's easier if it's right in your ordinance, but if you ever get to a point, if it's not in your ordinance and you have somebody pressing you on that, give me a call and I'll give you the statutory reference. Or I'll have that conversation with a contractor or landowner. All right, what do we mean? It's excavation contractors that you typically think of. It's not homeowners doing their own work. It's not agriculture by legitimate farmers or farming operations. It's not timber harvesting. By the way, these guys already have a whole host of their own best management practices for timber harvesting and agriculture to ensure that they're not going to have discharges of soil to the water. Okay. That's why they're excluded from this requirement. And homeowners also have to follow the rules. They just don't have to be certified. As a homeowner doing my own work, I don't need to be certified on my own land. But I also can't have a discharge. That's illegal. But so we're just talking about those that have to have the certification number. It also excludes municipal, state, and federal employees conducting work associated with their employment. What do we mean? Town public works, going around, digging around culverts, replacing culverts. They don't have to be certified. And you know what? Most of those guys and gals are already going to these trainings. They already understand erosion control measures and BMPs. So that's why they're also exempted. All right.
That was Lebanon.
It does look like Lebanon.
Actually, it is.
Oh, yes.
Actually, it is. How are you guys doing? You want a 5-minute, 2-minute leg stretch, or do you want to keep cranking away here? Do it. All right. If you need to use a restroom or something, feel free to hop up. Yeah, this actually is Lebanon. I might or might not have removed that if I knew I was gonna be, knew it was.
Can't you tell by all the sheds along the side of the water? Yeah.
So
Too many.
there is this provision, this exemption, structure exemption that allows, if you have kind of a step system with your accessory structures, then that's exempt. But if they had them out of order, then they would be regulated and they'd be.
No.
They're out of order. No, he's kidding.
So, no, I am kidding.
I'm gonna say.
Non-conforming structures, these are probably actually illegal, but we're not here to talk about that tonight. I'm not going to talk to you tomorrow about it either. All right. Structure, no and no. Why? Because these are watercraft. All right. This is just somebody pulling the watercraft up onto the shoreline. Registered as a watercraft or not being required to be registered as a watercraft, they're watercraft. We're not regulating these things. What about the house? The 100-foot setback?
Doesn't
No,
work.
that might be 22 feet.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not very
I
far.
measured. I didn't actually measure, but it's very close. All right. You have non-conforming structures. You have non-conforming uses. What do we mean by this? When something's assigned the designation non-conforming, that's simply saying it doesn't meet today's standards, but it was legally in existence before the standards took effect. All right, shoreline zoning first took effect in 1971 by state law, but town municipal ordinances were all either adopted or adopted for them, the very first ordinances, no later than 1974. Okay, a lot of the towns had ordinances in 73 or so, no later than 74. So established uses, in this case, a non-conforming use is a use that's not allowed in the district. Okay, a limited residential district on Northeast Pond. All right. Well, we want to build a commercial office building there. No, it's a non-conform. It's not an allowed use. All right. But if somebody already had that use there, they built in the 1960s, and it's a commercial office building in a limited residential district, then it's a non-conforming use, legally existing non-conforming. All right, so that's what we mean. It's not allowed in the district, but it was established lawfully at the time of the ordinance. And then there are some standards that affect the planning board here. Expansion is limited to residential uses and structures only, so residential's the only expansion that can happen. But what if the use is discontinued? What if it's this local sandwich shop, sub shop, maybe gas station in a residential district? You know, it's on the corner, it's next to the river. If there are standards that say if it's discontinued for more than 1 year, then it cannot be resumed. So if it closes for more than a year, it's gone. With one exception, the planning board consider a 1 year extension for that upon a showing of good cause. Well, gee, you know, we had a fire. The insurance company wouldn't settle with us. There's a death in the family. You know, a good cause. We're not defining exactly what you need to determine what a good cause is. That's something you guys collectively as a planning board get to decide. You know, all right, does that sound legitimately like a good cause or not? Okay. So that would grant them a 1 year extension. So if it's, what do you do if it's a year and, let's say it's 13 and a half months, and then they come to the planning board and say, hey, we want this 1 year extension. The extension was not granted before the 1 year was up. I think the attorneys are going to tell you they're done. So if you know of a fire in a building, or you know there are extenuating circumstances going on, you don't want to see the business close, somebody might want to have that conversation with the owner. Say, just make sure you come to us within a year. If not with a, you know, if you don't reopen within a year, at least consider coming to the planning board for 1 year.
That'd be the same thing, let's say if they shut down, they're trying to sell the business.
Yes, very good point. We've seen that,
But
unfortunately.
they can't sell it, they're trying to find a buyer or whatever, they
Yeah.
need to come and get that, otherwise they're getting If it goes past that 1 year, then we lose it.
Yeah.
And then it can be turned into what, a house, residential dwelling. All right, and who wants to buy a gas station to live in? Really, it's
Just love you.
I won't ask any more questions. There is an exception for residential structures that have been maintained as a residential structure for previous 5 years. There's an exception there as well. They get an extension, or they can actually have that. They can be resumed after a year for residential use. So it'd be like a general development district where residential dwelling units are generally prohibited. That's your industrial commercial zone, and anyway, residential use could be resumed after a year, provided it's been maintained for the previous 5. All right, and then a non-conforming use cannot change to another non-conforming use, except the planning board again has the opportunity to review a change of a non-conforming use to another non-conforming use. So the gas station business sells, or they want to sell, or they do sell, and the next person just wants to, instead of having a gas station, they want to have a pizza shop. All right, it's also a commercial use in a residential district, non-conforming use. All right, that cannot happen unless the planning board determines that there will be no greater adverse impact with this new non-conforming use. All right.
So we couldn't go from pizza shop to gas station because
Oh.
that's
Yes.
right.
You're jumping ahead. Very good.
Okay.
No, yeah, you're understanding this. So no greater adverse impact. So consider that example. What if they took the pizza shop and changed to a
That's
gas
greater.
station?
Adverse,
You know,
yeah.
you're
Yeah.
putting fuel tanks in the ground.
Yeah.
Right.
As
It's
good
already
as the technology
non-conforming.
is, they'll leak. Someday they'll leak. And how close to the water body is it going to be? How close to somebody else's residential well is it going to be? So, yeah, greater adverse impact. Good catch. But that, again, is the planning board role to determine this no greater adverse impact. I can't say that any one of you board members, no matter how long you serve, I can't say that eventually you're all going to see this, or even one of you will ever see an application for this. We do see them statewide from time to time, here or there, but you don't see it a lot. But just be aware it is a function, and hopefully your code enforcement officer, your current interim code enforcement officer, knows all this stuff. Very good. You should offer him a job.
Right, I did.
God bless you.
All right, so we talked about non-conforming uses. The very first picture on the shoreline of No Name Pond in some town in southern Maine contained non-conforming structures. Okay, this is another example in the town of Sebago, actually. Sebago Lake over here. Non-conforming structure, a structure that does not meet the standards, just like the use. Non-conforming use doesn't meet the standards, but was established lawfully at the time of construction. So back in 1974, your ordinance would have said these structures needed to be 75 feet. Today it's 100 feet, or as of early 90s, it's 100 feet from the lake. All right, but this was constructed in, let's say, 1976 at 78 feet from the water. Okay, it was legally in existence at that point in time. Then in the early 90s became non-conforming, right? Because the rules changed. But it was legally in existence prior to the enactment of the rules. What if this house was just built last year? Did they build a non-conforming structure?
Yes.
Yeah.
An illegal one.
Ah,
Not necessarily, right?
they built an illegal structure,
Right.
not a non-conforming structure. Remember the
Non-conforming is legal.
it may sound like semantics here, but it's really very important because non-conformance is a very specific designation afforded only to those that were legally in existence at the time of the ordinance. All right? If you start citing people for having a new non-conforming structure, then they're going to look at the non-conforming structure section saying, yeah, we got a non-conforming structure. All right, it's a distinction that has to be made. All right, a new structure that doesn't comply
It's
is
illegal.
illegal.
Do you have to make them pull that thing down?
This was legally existing non-conforming structure.
Oh,
This guy had other problems. This guy had tree cutting problems. He had an addiction to tree cutting. Let's just say that. That was a number of years ago, but we use that slide more for the non-conforming structure. All right. There's standards that allow for repair and maintenance of a non-conforming structure in the shoreline zone. You need to re-shingle the roof, right? Do you need to go to the CEO or planning board to get a permit for that? No. I hope not in town of Lebanon. I'm not aware of any town where you have to go to re-shingle your roof or re-side your house or repaint your house. It's repair and maintenance. The ordinance allows for standard repair and maintenance. However, if somebody says, "Oh, well, I'm going to redo my whole roof," okay, that might be repair and maintenance. That's a little more than repair and maintenance, but it's not a big portion of the house. But if I want to do that, and while I'm at it, I'm going to jack it up and put a new foundation under it. And while I'm at it, I'm going to might as well fix those sills that are rotten and change out the whole first floor decking, because that's really kind of soft. You see where this is going. It starts to add up. We're no longer talking about repair and maintenance. So there's this threshold. There's a threshold built into the ordinance that says, all right, you're allowed to do in-place reconstruction or replacement if you've removed no more than or less than 50% of the structure's market value. And it doesn't matter whether you remove it or it's damaged or destroyed. Okay, so tornado rips through, tears off, the deck and the sunroom. All right, it doesn't matter how that damage occurs. If it's less than 50% of the market value, they can get a CEO permit to rebuild right in place. All right, but what if they go over that? What if they say, "Oh, well, we want to do more than 50% of the market value, or we're going to do this, and this," and they've in so doing they are removing more than 50% of that structure's market value. They can still reconstruct it. They are still allowed by ordinance, by law, to rebuild that. It's just at that point it has to undergo this relocation review. So nonconformities are afforded special protections or rights, provided there's not a whole lot being done to them. Repair and maintenance, less than 50% market value, removal. You remove a substantial portion of that structure and you might have just lost some of your nonconformity rights or grandfathered rights, however you want to say it. You're allowed to rebuild. Absolutely. We're not going to tell you you cannot. It's just the planning board would be the designee in Lebanon to review an application for relocation to meet the shoreline setback to the greatest practical extent. Okay, it's not saying you have to relocate to meet the shoreline setback of 100 feet from a lake or 75 feet from a stream. It's to the greatest practical extent. And we'll expound on that in a minute. It's also a provision that says if you put a new foundation under, you have to also relocate as well. All right. So how do we consider market value? Yes, that's the very next slide.
I'll tell you what it is, I'm kidding.
He's a real estate.
Oh, I'll take a break for a minute while you explain. I'm happy to. You probably do understand it better than me. It's typically something that appraisers are this is routine for them and probably real estate folks as well. Market value, as we say here, relates only capital letters to the value of the non-conforming structure. The structure has the exact same value, the dollar value, whether it's located so that there's $1 million view or it's located next to the town dump, or what do we call them? Transfer station. There we go.
Don't call it the dump.
That's right. A little old-fashioned here. So here's the $1 million view looking across Long Lake in Naples towards Mount Washington with snow-capped. Gorgeous, gorgeous view. We did have problems with this site as well, but won't get into that. Okay, what's the value? So the value of that structure, is it more or less or the same as the value of the structure next to the transfer station? Same value. It's just the physical structure. Okay, ignore everything else around it. Ignore the land it sits on. This is how it's written. It's the value of the structure. All right, that's very important to keep in mind. You'll get people coming in the door saying, "Oh, this is worth a lot more than that. This is a $750,000 structure when it's like that." You know, that's a $750,000 structure. No, it isn't. You know, that's a $17,000, $22,000 structure on a $732,000 piece of property. Okay. What's that?
With no trees.
With no trees. Oh, there are trees now. That was a before photo. All right. What about the 50% market value threshold? The language says, which is removed or damaged or destroyed, regardless of the cause, by more than 50% of the market value of the structure before such damage, destruction, removal. Well, I can tell you what it doesn't take into consideration. It doesn't take into consideration material and labor. You know, I'm a contractor. I can fix this back up for this amount of money. It's going to cost you this much in labor and this much in materials. It has nothing to do with that. Okay, I'll elaborate a little bit in a minute. And it also doesn't apply to basic repair and maintenance. Okay, I'm re-shingling my roof, or next year, and I'm out there re-siding my house. You have to consider all the elements of the projects. Here's what I'm removing. In this example, removing the roof, the sills due to rot, walls due to mold, windows, doors, etc. You're not getting hung up with how many coats of paint or how many coats of varnish. I've had appraisers submit those reports before, and the doorknob and lock sets are this much value. It's just, well, I mean, technically it all counts, but to us it's just kind of nonsensical. Let's not get hung up on that. All right, somebody's removing the kitchen cabinets. Well, there's some value there. If it's old in an old camp or cottage, there's probably not a lot of value there. But all right, we'll count that. What about the shag carpet in the living room? No, we're just not. How much value is there? How much would you pay for that?
Nothing.
Dirty old shag carpet from the 70s. But this is what you do consider is they come in and they say, and usually the CEO is having this conversation, but occasionally they'll get flustered with the code enforcement officer and say, fine, I'll just go to the planning board like you're telling me I have to do. And then I'm going to try to sell on my case that I'm under 50% market value removal. And they're going to say, oh, here's what I'm doing. I'm just removing the roof. I'm just removing the sill, I'm removing the first floor joist and second floor joist and exterior walls and
the foundation.
But I'll tell you what, that decking on the floor downstairs, we're going to keep that. And we're going to keep that stone fireplace. That stone chimney. Stone chimney has value, but once they've exceeded that threshold, then they're in the door for an application about relocating to meet the setback to the greatest practical extent. The easiest way to explain this is you have a cardboard box right here. All right? You have walls, and you have a roof, and you have sides, and floor, or whatever. Well, let's tear off this flap. Is that more than 50% of that box's market value? No. What about the second flap? I mean, this is how we're getting to this. And the rule of thumb we use, and we talk to CEOs about in the CEO workshops, is use some common sense. If it's clearly far less than 50% market value, below 45% market value or 48%, if it's pretty clear, just do a CEO review. If it's very obviously removing greater than 50% of the market value, send it to these guys. All right? If it's somewhere flirting right with that line and you're saying, I think you need to go to the planning board. I don't want to go to the planning board. I don't want to have to relocate it. Okay? Then at that point, the CEO should be telling them, all right, hire your appraiser to give us the numbers. And that's the right person to do those numbers is an appraiser. They do this for insurance purposes all the time. They do this. This is not a foreign concept. There's only been one appraiser that I've ever talked to, not in this region, up in the Freiburg area, that said, oh, I'm not even going to do your appraisal because I know what DEP is going to say. They're just going to twist it to try to get us get it relocated. And they didn't understand the concept behind it. But all the other appraisers I've ever talked with have understood this without batting an eye. Yep, fine, I get that. So if they come to you and they have an appraisal report, that should be sufficient to say, all right, it's in your hands, acknowledge it's greater than 50%. Now we're going to go through this relocation review. Doesn't automatically mean it's going to be relocated, but they're in the door for the review. That's just saying what I've already said. All right, so you get an application in the door, and it's for a tear down, rebuild of a house, or removing more than 50% of the structure's market value, 75% of it, or whatever. It's usually, by the way, it's usually a full tear down and rebuild when it comes to you guys. There are specific criteria listed right in your ordinance. You don't have to come up with your own. It's right there. But you do have to stick with only what the list says, okay? And it's these things like this: size of the lot, slope of the land, potential for soil erosion, locations of other existing structures on the parcel or on adjacent parcels, and I'm going to expound on these a little bit. The location of the existing septic system or other on-site soil suitable for a future septic system, and the type and the condition of the existing foundation. And there's also, I don't know why I didn't list it here, but there's also one that says, and the type and amount of vegetation that's got to be removed. All right, so they're spelled out right in your ordinance. All right, these are your criteria you consider. So my recommendation, DP's recommendation to the board would be to say, start at the first one. Well, let's look at the size of, well, you kind of have to look at everything all together, but the size of the lot. Is it one of these 50 by 80 postage stamp lots? If so, you already have a sense, all right, it might not be able to move back any, or it might not be able to move back a whole lot. All right, size of the lot, slope of the land. Size of the lot's plenty obvious, all right? They have a large lot that goes back at least to the 250-foot shoreland zone line. Well, they've got a lot of land. The slope of the land, what do we mean by that? The slope of the land is like this. Is that too steep to push them back on? No. You know?
No, we're gonna.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All right. At some point, and I can't tell you tonight what that is. You're gonna see it when you're out on your site walk. You're gonna look at the topo survey that they provided in their site plan to you. You're gonna look at things like that. Just because it's fairly steep, does that mean they can't relocate? Well, guess what? Right now it's on that same steep slope down here. It's on posts, and they're going to move it back. But they're either going to rebuild it on that steep slope down closer to the water, or they're going to rebuild it on the steep slope further back. Something else to consider. I'm not telling you what the answer is, because every site's a little different, or a lot different. And you're going to do a site walk for those. Definitely do a site walk for relocations. All right. Potential for soil erosion. Well, that might be related to the slope. It's also related to the type of soil that you have there. Is it clay? Is it sand? Is it, I don't know, some other very fine sedimentary material that's very fine and very prone to erosion? Again, it's going to have some slope. If it's flat and it's very fine sedimentary type of material, well, it's probably not going to go anywhere. All right, so this is kind of a combination of slope and the types of soil. Very infrequently, I can't think of any time where soil, this criterion has ever influenced, been the key factor for a planning board's decision on relocation. But it's something you have to consider. You have to consider the location of other existing structures on the parcel and on adjacent parcels. Obviously, if the garage is right behind you, you can't move it back there. Power lines, what about power lines? It's usually a utility easement corridor through there, but even if it's not, don't put them right underneath the power lines. What about, so the other example first, considering structures not just on the subject parcel, but on abutting parcels. what if, you know, I wish I had a slide of this, but, you know, what if this is the water line? Here are your budding properties here where the setback for the structures is, say, 35 feet. And this one was at 35 feet. And they're the ones that are rebuilding. And now you're considering relocation. They've got plenty of room back here to relocate. But if you do, and the lots are very tight together, they're only 35-foot wide lots or 50-foot wide lots, they're going to be looking at the back of the other cottages. I'm not saying this is a deal breaker that they can't move back. I'm simply saying that's something the board should consider. You know, maybe it's excessive. One I ran into in Lyman earlier this past summer, they had that scenario where they had the two camps on abutting lots, and they were talking about that amongst themselves after I gave them some fundamental info, and they're having the discussion. But they're way over here, 35 feet, 30 feet from the water. If this guy moved back to 100 feet, they're not going to get any view blocked from structures on adjacent parcels. So those are the sorts of things to consider there. Well, what about the septic system? They should have an existing septic system, but we're also looking at other soils on site where you might have a future septic system. You know, maybe it's important for the board to say, hey, give us a HHE 200 and another septic design for your next septic system. You have to do that if you're adding a bedroom, right? Why not ask them for that? I'm not saying you have to, but a lot of boards do. All right, well, tell us where that's going to be and what that's going to look like. And then you have something more concrete to look at. Why do we have that standard in there? Well, I'll tell you right now, we'd much rather have the septic system further from the lake than the structure. Think about it. We'd rather have the septic system further from the lake than the structure. But that's a consideration. The type and condition of the existing foundation. Well, before I get to that, the amount of vegetation that has to be removed. All right, that's not. I didn't add that to the list for some reason. I'm not sure why, and I apologize. But that is the other criteria that you'd consider. If the structure is 28 feet from the lake, and right behind the structure it is the densest vegetation, and it's really other areas around the structure are pretty wide open on abutting lots, it's lawn or it's been cut. But this is a very dense section of vegetation with a steep, let's say with a steep slope coming down to it. You know, the steep slope may stop 118 feet away from the shoreline, but all that water is draining off the road and coming down that steep slope into this buffer, this wooded buffer. Well, if you cut that down, remove that just to move the structure back, now you've lost the buffering capacity of that, what I'm going to say, very valuable buffer area. Okay, that is not something we frequently see, but that would be the type of scenario where you'd really give that a lot of weight. All right, it's not up on the list, but you'd give that a fair amount of weight. You'd say, all right, this is really an effective buffer. It's within 100 feet of the lake, and this is really, you know, doing a lot for lake water quality. That's the type of vegetation we're talking about. It's not the, well, I can't move back planning board because I've got 2 trees back there. Oh, my grandkid's swing is on that oak tree back there. It's not about that. 2 trees can be planted, and environmental types, buffer people would tell you, well, those 2 big trees are providing, you know, of taking up a lot of nutrients, taking up a lot of water, but if it's lawn all around underneath it, well, it's not doing a lot. You're better off to cut those 2 trees down, 3 trees down, and move the structure further back. And there's a requirement in the ordinance that says you got to if you do that, you got to revegetate, replant not only the area where the original structure was located. That can be planted with grass or shrubs or trees or any combination thereof. But you got to, if you remove 3 trees back here, you got to replant. If you remove 3 trees like this, should replant, you know, 2 for 1. So 6 trees this big. And that's all part of the review. The one thing that you can't get caught up in is the guy that tells you, oh, I can't move that house back beyond 100 feet. Look at that forest back there beyond 100 feet. The vegetation removal standards, the buffer standards, are the most strict within 100 feet of the lake. All right, that's where you can do some cutting, vegetation removal, but you can't do a whole lot. Beyond 100 feet, there's still some regulation out there for vegetation removal, but far, far, far less restrictive. I ran into this one time where a board said, oh yeah, we didn't want to see those trees cut down beyond 100 feet from the lake, so we let them keep the cottage and let them rebuild it within 100 feet. Well, the guy the next day turned around and cut down the trees 100 feet. Why? Because he could. He legally could. So the planning board said, oh, we want to preserve those trees. There's no condition. How do you really condition that if the ordinance expressly allows the removal of those trees? So just be cautious of that. You know, vegetation removal should apply to the buffer area more than anything else. All right. Then the last provision here is criteria that you'd consider is the type and condition of the existing foundation. All we mean by that is this. If the house is 13 feet from the lake, but it has this awesome foundation that gets like a score of 95%. You know, you have to do almost no work to that foundation to be able to reuse it. DEP's opinion, this is not written into as a standard, but DEP's opinion is, you know, when you're considering that criteria, it's reasonable for a planning board to say, yeah, rebuild on the existing foundation. It's perfectly good, perfectly usable as is. We'd rather not see a perfectly good, usable foundation get yarded out of the ground. It's not that we look at cost, but there is a cost thing there. We got to have a little common sense. But it's going to dig a big hole 13 feet from the lake or 22 feet from wherever that is, and then we're going to relocate it and dig another big hole. Yes, no, they're not allowed to have a soil discharge to the water. Yes, they would have to revegetate that with grass or something, but you know, it's just, that's how DEP looks at it, and we'd encourage towns to look at it the same way. Foundations, we're talking not post supports, we're talking about concrete block or poured concrete, or in some cases wood foundations, but it's not very common in Maine. But that's what we mean by that particular provision. What do you do if you're really stymied by a site? You can ask me. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Here's exactly what you need to do, unless it's blatantly obvious. And somehow you missed it because you missed a provision, or you're caught up in hearing the landowner sob story about, this is my great grandmother's house and her great grandfather built it out of, you know, hand hewn beams, and we just want to have it right here. And you know, so we're human beings. So if it's obvious and you're asking me, I will say, yeah, it really needs to go back to 100 feet or 80 feet or whatever that what seems to be readily apparent to me. If, you know, I would say probably 60% of the time I'm asked by a planning board, should we require it to be moved back? All right, let's do a site walk. Because I don't want to pretend to sit in Portland looking at a survey site plan. Yeah, here's the answer. You know, yep, it can go back. So anyway, it's you know, we might do a site walk. Maybe it's with just the chairman or one of the planning board members. You know, I don't know. You have to avoid this. We're having an official site walk. It's got to be put a notice in the paper, you know, or you can do it that way. Put a notice in the paper and let's do a formal site walk. You know, I don't care how it's done, but you could talk to the CEO and call Mike and have him come out and take a look. But I'd rather have that conversation with you guys because you're the ones that are going to be reviewing the next one, and I'd like you to understand my logic or DEP's logic behind, I think it ought to go here or there or otherwise. All right. Things to not consider as a planning board when you're considering relocating to meet the structure setback to the greatest practical extent. You don't look at the cost of the relocation. You don't consider the neighbor's view impact. The guy across the street or the next door, as much as they're going to stand there at the podium and tell you for the next hour, you know, I've had this view of the lake. You know, that is not a factor. It's size of the lot, slope of the land, the location of other structures on the property and on adjacent properties, soil erosion, septic systems, blah, 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 foundation. It's not the butter's view, it's not cost relocation. You're also not considering relocation of a proposed expanded structure. The planning board only considers relocation of the original structure. Okay, what I mean by that is this. All right, I'm gonna stand up so everybody. Okay, here's the original footprint of the structure, okay? This is what, we're proposing to tear this down, move it by more than 50% of the market value, whatever you want to call it. And planning board's considering relocation to the greatest practical extent. So they're saying, here's the existing condition. Yeah, and here's what we're proposed to relocate. Okay? We propose to relocate that. And our limit is here. Okay, the shoreline's down here. Our limit is right here. Okay? This is not what the planning board is actually reviewing. You're reviewing relocation of the original structure's footprint, not the expanded footprint. This is what we want to build. This goes back. You see the difference? Instead of stopping here, the original footprint actually goes back here. Okay, I don't know what this is. It depends on the site. But you gotta consider the relocation not of the expanded structure, but of the original structure. 99 times out of 100, you're going to get the site plan from the applicant showing we started with this and we're moving this back, and we can't move back as far. You have a question, Deborah?
So if you see that, where they have something this big, and then they're gonna relocate something this big, would they hold them then only to this big, and then they have to apply differently for an addition? Is that?
Yes. The CEO considers any expansion. That's entirely separate from the planning board's review.
So they would not then approve based on the fact that they're asking for original plus expansion. They could only approve original, and then CEO would have to look at expansion.
Right. Some ordinances give the planning board the ability to consider an expansion only after the original structure is relocated. Now we can expand, and we can only. So think about it. If they move the original footprint back to meet the setback to the greatest practical extent, this is the point right here. Now they don't come in the door and expand back here further. No, because this is as far back as it can be relocated practically. All right, so their expansion should be either up, vertical, or horizontal, outwards, laterally, no closer to the shoreline and not further back. In the cases where a planning board, if they want to submit a plan to the planning board showing what their expansion would be after the original footprint's relocated back, the planning board would then have the ability to say, well, you meet the expansion criteria or you don't. But generally that's what I'm trying to capture here. But generally that's a CEO function. Usually all the planning board's looking at is just relocation of that
structure.
One CEO in the town of Naples, very good CEO, in their town ordinance, they give that relocation review authority to the code enforcement officer, not the planning board. And that's fine with DEP. So she has that review authority, and she explains it to applicants coming in the door to her that are proposing a relocation. Look, if it's simpler for you to figure it out this way, take your site plan that your surveyor did, take a pair of scissors, and cut out the shape of the footprint of your existing structure shown on the plan. Now take that and move it around. Where can that go? Because that's what we're moving back. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, it's the simpler way, perhaps, for some to understand what that means. All right, and these, I'll tell you, I'm more than happy to come down and meet with a planning board, do a site walk, if you'd find it to be helpful. If you've done these and you feel comfortable with them, great. If you haven't and you'd like that assistance, I'm more than happy to do that. Preferably not in the dark.
Where's your sense of adventure?
In Portland. Whatever that's that's all right. All right, so these are two different examples. Hey, we've already gone over it. This is the original location. So this is example one. This is the application you're gonna see come in the door. Yeah, we're relocating that as far back as we can move it. We can't move it any further back because our proposed expansion is here, beyond the 75-foot setback from the river. That's not greatest practical extent. Example number two is how it actually works. Here's the original size structure. You relocate it, and once it's relocated, then they can figure out what they can expand, whatever that looks like. So anyway, just to drive that home if I hadn't already. All right, planning board with relocation. The original location of the structure has to be revegetated. All right. Then again, I mentioned earlier, there's standards that say it can be grass, shrubs, trees, or any combination thereof. It can't be a flower garden. All right. It's got to be something legit. There are other things. I mentioned earlier, what if you have this great stand of trees and shrubs and everything else is functioning as a decent runoff, stormwater runoff buffer or something like that, but you still feel that can be removed and relocate the structure further back in the long term. There are standards that say whatever that was they removed, they've got to replant. Let's say this is the relocation, and they had to remove, instead of physically removing the structure, all of it, and then rebuilding it, they kept the shell, or most of the shell, but they actually physically remove what is remaining of this structure, the 40% market value. They bring in the beams and the wheels and they slide that back. Well, they got to cut all these trees and all that vegetation. Well, then they're on the hook for replanting that vegetation. Native trees, native shrubs, and that sort of thing. All right, and that's what we're getting at here. The revegetation standards in the ordinance that specify, this is what it should look like. Professional revegetation plan, professional, we're not sure who that is. Not going to say who that is, but it's probably not the landowner. It's probably not the contractor unless you trust that they know what they're talking about. It could be a landscape nursery worker that does this sort of thing. It could be a landscape architect. It could be a forester. It could be an arborist, I suppose. But taking a site, structure was removed. This actually was a violation. I'm looking more at Chip for this, but revegetation occurs. This is what we're trying to accomplish here and get something back to function as a buffer. It's not plant one tree over there and one tree over there. We're good. It's not that. There was a new structure rebuild, new structure build. I can't lie. This is also a violation. Destroyed a whole bunch of vegetation in the buffer and had to replant. You're not replanting. This is what was removed, and this is what you're going to see removed for structure relocation. You're not. What's that?
It's not ornamental.
No, it's not ornamental. But you're not also replanting 65, 89-foot tall pine trees either, are you? All right. It's not practical. This is what we're stuck with, or this is what reality is. I'm not sure how you want to term it, but they're going to be 6 to 8 foot tall hardwoods. They're going to be 3 to 5 foot tall softwoods. In it, one tree every 80 square feet. Shrubs every 3 feet on center. It's going to look pretty sparse for the first couple of years. And you're going to get questions from the public. How could they do that? Well, they had a revegetation plan that met the standards. Yeah, it is what it is. Give it a few more years. Give it 10 years. The idea is that these standards are projecting out what it's going to look like in 10 years, in 15 years. And it's going to end up looking something much more like that in a while. Unless the landowner poisons the trees or cuts them or girdles them or anyway.
Right.
Never ever happens. Replaced, I'm going to blow through this fairly quickly. Replace native species, saplings at a minimum for height. Saplings are defined at least 4.5 feet above ground level. The replanting for trees is something like minimum 2 inches diameter, breast height 4.5 feet above the ground. It can't be all just a monoculture. Replanting all sweet fern. Well, you got to replant sweet fern, you replant some this species and that species, you know, to kind of mix it up like you tend to find in the woods. No one species should make it more than 50% of the replanting. We talked about replanting for shoreline stabilization. There should be a survival rate provision in the plan, or if not, as a condition of the planning board's approval when replanting is required. Minimum 80% survival for 5 years. It's in the standards as well. Or it's in our 2015 standards. It might be in your town ordinance standards presently, or will be shortly, I'm sure. Shrubs, I'm just going to say there are standards built into the language as well dealing with shrubs. It's trees, shrubs. Then the last piece is ground cover vegetation as well. That's your low bush blueberries, that's your ferns, I don't know. If there's that sort of thing growing originally, how do we tell? We look at the area adjacent to it where it hasn't been disturbed. If it's growing there, that's what needs to grow to be put back. This is a shoreline stabilization site on Fry Island in Sebago Lake, where they took everything down to bare soil in excess of what they needed to, but some of it was permitted. I won't get into that, but they had to reestablish the tree layer, the shrub layer, and the ground cover layer. Ground cover, low vegetation, fern type stuff growing in between, and then to mimic the humus layer, leaf litter, pine spills, you know, that stuff, kind of layer on top that the rainwater penetrates and goes down in. They had it down to bare soil, and not to promote a product by a company, but I just don't know of any other companies that sell this product. It can be an erosion control mulch that's very common, no more than a couple inches, or this New England Organics sells this stuff called superhumus. It's this softer, binds together well product that more closely mimics the natural duff layer. That'd be more like, excuse me, please, 4 to 6 inches with that put down. I'm not suggesting going out and telling everybody, you got to go to New England Organics. They're just a company that sells this product, and I know there's other companies out there that sell some. I'm just using that as an example. That's my legal disclaimer. But that's got to be put down in place as well. And again, survival, functionality, sufficient to remain in compliance with the vegetation standards for 5 years, minimum 5 years. All right, this is a closer look of the same site. You see the low growing veg. You see the superhumus in between. This is maybe 2 years into the replant, but that's what we're talking about. You know, so rainwater hits that, and it's penetrating. It's going down in. All right, these are our mug shots. 3 of us statewide. I cover this lower tier. Got my number. Got my card here, if you'd like it. So that's all I have for a presentation type of discussion. That's the planning board. There's a lot more to shoreland zoning than this. I tried to gear it tonight towards planning board function. The CEO attends our annual CEO workshops, which you're welcome to attend to. Well, oftentimes planning board members do attend, where we cover everything shoreland zoning related. Vegetation removal, non-conforming structure expansions, all this and all that. So we usually hold those in end of April here in southern Maine, or beginning of May. But anyway, so that's more focus on planning board role or planning board responsibilities. Happy to, if I can still talk, I'm happy to answer questions if you have some, or.
I have a couple.
Oh, sure.
Somebody comes in and they present the application that they're going to do more than what you determined during the talk. More than 50% of the market value has been exceeded. So they know that they're going to go into relocation. So they say, okay, we're going to split the project. Can they do that?
Oh, good question. So we'll do 30% this year, and next year we'll do, yeah. There's this thing called attempting to circumvent the regulations. It's a legal thing. And we've had that conversation with our Attorney General's office in the past, and they've said, you know, there isn't a whole lot of good court guidance there. There haven't been really any or many cases out there that we can really rely on for shoreline zoning purposes and this sort of thing. But they said, you know, we're very comfortable to say there's somebody, particularly if somebody comes in and tells us this is what we're going to do. If I've got to do this relocation thing, blank, 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 then I'm going to do this year, and I'm going to do that next year. The CEOs know from the training to document, document, document. Well, sir, well, ma'am, understand that if you do that, we're going to have to deny it based on an attempt to circumvent the regulations, which is illegal. All right? What about those time limits? We don't know. We don't know what that looks like. The Attorney General's office has said, we're very confident that if they do one project this year, they do another project next year, they do a, you know, like a 1 year separation, then that's an attempt. That could be fairly easily, you know, a case to make in court to say, attempting to circumvent and feeling like they'd be successful. Well, what about a year and a half? What about 2 years? You know, we have that conversation. I don't know. We don't have court cases out there to guide us. The one thing I will say is we don't, as regulators, it's while we try to help people, well, hey, this project won't work for you. What if you do this over here on your property instead? Or as an alternative, why don't you do it over there? Or why don't you just do such and such? We can offer that advice, but as regulators, we really cannot offer the advice, well, do this year and do that next, or 2 years from now. We just can't do that. If they tell you, I'm attempting to circumvent, then you got to document this stuff so that you'll have a case if it ever comes up. If they don't tell you and they say, well, all right, you know, we're just going to do this year. And then next April 1, they come in and say, yep, we're doing just this year. Then it's a little harder to prove, but you can start to document that. And if cumulatively we're over that 50% market value, yeah, it's really more a code enforcement function at that point. But you know, then it's up to the town to determine whether they're going to take a case or cite them or deny them. Oftentimes it's a denial. And go from there. But I just don't know what to tell you in terms of time, except to say a landowner has some rights. And if they say, "Oh, I'm doing this year," yeah, I mean, I built my house 15 years ago, and then I built an addition 4 years ago. I should have the right to do that without feeling any concern of somebody coming after me for attempting to circumvent a regulation. You know, and 5 years is probably plenty reasonable. 3 years. Probably plenty reasonable. The other thing to consider, we get that question a lot, and we do hear about it, and it's very rare. But I think it's just because people don't love the idea of having their nice summer cottage on the lake torn up this year, this summer, and all next summer. I mean, I know people do construction projects during the winter, but a lot of it gets done during the summer. They want to be able to go to their cottage and enjoy it. So they're not willing to play a game like that. So I guess that's circumventing or multi-phase projects in a nutshell. Some of it we know, some of it we don't. But good question.
We had an applicant maybe 4 years ago that was going to do a partial tear down. They didn't exceed the 50%.
Okay.
They got it half torn down, and then they decided they wanted to do more.
This is a very, very good point to raise. All right. So this is something where if you're the CEO looking at this less than 50%, or a planning board considering more than 50%, planning board not as much, but especially when somebody's flirting with that 50% and a CEO makes a decision, you know, I think you're less. Then they're tearing off the roof, this one back wall on the north side because there's rot and mold, the sills, and some other work, and we're at 45%. You know, let's just estimate. The contractor gets in there and says, "Oh, well, we can't stop there. Look at all this rot in the rest of the sills. And what about the floor? Now that's soft, and the first floor joists, are all rotted. we've got to tear all that out. It's going to be a lot more expensive to come back in and do that later. Well, now adding that to the picture, they've exceeded 50% market value. So don't be surprised if you get that sort of application coming in the door.
There's no buffer kind of put in there, like a 15% buffer that you
Yes.
for things like that.
Yes. It's a 50%
For emergencies.
It's just they know it. They need to do their homework ahead of time.
Well, I just know like when we do renovation loans, we have a 15% buffer, so you're allowed $35,000, but actually minus 15% for that instance because you cannot.
Oh, I see.
Just in case.
I gotcha. Yeah, there isn't built in. It's do your homework ahead of time and hire that contractor.
That's things because sometimes you don't know. Seriously, you don't know until you open it up.
Yep. All right. So here's the hardship with that. So you hit that. You've been as careful as you can be to not hit that 50% market value, to keep it under. So you're operating under a CEO permit. And now, we ran into fill in the blank. We've got to remove now more than 50% of the market value. You apply to the planning board. You go through the review. If you do have to relocate, you have to relocate. But you might not have to relocate. If it's on posts, there's a higher likelihood of it relocating. If it's on a foundation, less likely. But you gotta go through that. The benefit is on posts, contract, especially on posts, but even on a foundation, crawl space is more difficult sometimes. But posts, the contractor you hired, or as a landowner, you darn well should have crawled around underneath there. And if you don't know what you're looking at, then you tell your contractor to get on his back end and crawl under
On his knees.
the headlamp and figure it out ahead of time. If you're gonna be removing interior walls anyway, we'll tear off a few of those old V-match pine boards and see if there's mold in there or something. I sound like the cold-hearted regulator, I know.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Usually a home inspector or your contractor should know to be able to tell if there's been leaks in areas where you're more likely to find that stuff anyway. So.
Exactly. So oftentimes what we recommend to CEOs is to tell them, look, you're awfully close to this 50% threshold. To account for these what ifs, just know that if there is something more, you will have to stop. Do you want to just go through the greatest practical extent relocation review now with the planning board, or do you want to do it when you run into the what ifs? It's probably simpler to do it now, or scale back your project in anticipation of it. So it's a tough one. I get that. You're midway through your project. You're trying to get it done before it snows, or you want to get it done before summer so you can enjoy it. And we ran into fill in the blank.
Or you have no more money to change.
Well,
Course.
there's that, but yeah, it's a tough one.
Put in that buffer.
Yeah.
Do it yourself. Apply that buffer to your own monetary.
Yeah, I'd say they should go right back to the realtor and say, "You're the one that sold it."
We always get that. It's always our fault.
You always blame for everything.
That's right.
Understand? I am 100% kidding.
It's always our fault.
No, very good point. But it's more a CEO thing typically, because if they're already over 50% visiting you guys, then they're already relocating to meet the setback to the greatest practical extent. So if they're proposing to remove 60% and then they find they've got to remove another 15%, it's still relocated to meet the setback to the greatest practical extent. It's the CEO permitting, keeping them under 50%, and then if something more comes up. What you guys can do as a planning board is to try to expedite the review if you want to be nice. But
Can you talk a little bit about maybe permits after the fact?
oh, yes, very good point. All right, so planning board receives an after the fact permit, like let's say a greatest practical extent relocation. Somebody started a project that didn't, 100% removal. They come in the door. Well, we've got the footing poured or the foundation poured, and then realized, okay, we're caught, we were supposed to follow the ordinance and come see you guys, and we didn't. So now what's your responsibility as a planning board?
Air it out. No, I'm kidding. I don't know what it is.
That's for Sarah.
But do you consider that they've already, do you consider their sob story? Do you consider that they've already put money into the footing and foundation? You can't. You can't. Did you say that?
Yeah,
Yes, you can. You have to consider it as though it's before the fact. And again, I'm sounding like the cold-hearted regulator, but it's just the cold-hearted regulations. You just have to consider what it would be if they came to you before the fact, as though nothing had been done yet.
I was always told if you have to question whether a permit is needed, it probably is. So there should be no forgiveness for that. You know, a lot of people say, "Do you think I need a permit for this?" Well, the fact that you thought that you might, you probably do.
It's worth going and asking.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because
at
you
least
can't
ask.
do it and then ask for forgiveness later. Some towns make you tear it right out.
Yeah. There's a town in southern Maine that I've been working with where there's been some violations. A former code enforcement officer issued some permits improperly. And one of them had to do with a new foundation. Well, there was also a tear down rebuild, but there's a new foundation. CEO had no authority to allow this person to build 43 feet 1 inch from the lake without a variance from, well, that town's Board of Appeals, whatever town that is in southern Maine. And there's some legal precedents from the courts that have said, okay, if you've already framed it up, shame on the town. It's kind of too late to chase after them. It's kind of this equitable estoppel provision of law. On the other hand, what if they've only poured the footing and put in an illegal holding tank, septic holding tank or something, and then some grading work? Well, that's not much of a start on the property. The Attorney General's office reviewed the matter and said, yep, what we already suspected anyway from other court cases we've seen as staff, they confirmed that, that they had a permit from the code enforcement officer. It was improperly issued, but the landowner at that point was not protected. The person that already framed it up and has a roof on and all that, well, it's too late. The horse is out of the barn. But the little bit of site work that's gone on, they haven't established a vested right, if you will. And the courts have said, despite a town official giving a permit,
Illegally.
You
have vested money in pouring this foundation and your illegal holding tank. Pretty much you're SOL. You're out of your money and you gotta yank it all out and move it.
How would
Because
that even
that
happen?
town official illegally.
It's
That is not okay.
It's as much that, you're right, but it's as much that that the landowner, the courts have said the landowner is responsible for following the book, despite whoever in the town is giving the
Who
permit.
issues the permit should follow the book, but as the landowner,
Yes,
you're also
100% right.
responsible. That's ridiculous. Then why do you need a permit if you have to follow? If you have to follow the letter of the law,
Well, I guess that's
why is
kinda-
somebody even issuing permits?
Well, there are standards, the vegetation removal standards. So we've talked about this 100-foot buffer next to a lake or 75-foot buffer next to a river or stream. The regulations are fairly rigid, limiting how much you can remove. Under Chapter 1000, there's no permit that's even needed under shoreland zoning, probably not for the town of Lebanon. You don't need to get a permit to cut vegetation on your property within the buffer, but you have to follow the ordinance. You have to follow the standards. So that in that case, there's not even a permit needed. It does look worse, I admit, when a CEO wrongly issues a permit, but the courts have said, doesn't matter. It's a hard one. But the planning board, what's that? The planning board still has to consider these things. If you're viewing an after the fact where permit was given improperly, you still have to consider what would it be if the permit had never been given, or if the project hasn't started yet. You gotta look at it as a before the fact project. And the one exception to this is this. All right, we are all humans, even those cold-hearted DEP people. All right, if your determination.
Joey's still out on that.
What's that?
Joey's still out on that.
doesn't like you anymore.
I've been told I suck the life out of people. I'm not proud of that fact. It's just. All right, I'm sorry. I'm doing my job, and that's what we're all doing.
Yes.
Board of Appeals, Planning Board, CEO. But the one exception would be if you're reviewing after the fact foundation. The foundation's in. Some site work, basic site work is done, and gee, we didn't go to the planning board, now you're reviewing that. If your determination is, well, we think it could have gone back 3 feet further, don't go there.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
surely.
I thought you were gonna say, I thought you were gonna say do it.
In that case, we call you.
I don't have icicles growing out of my yard yet. But no, I don't know what that number is. What if it's 10 feet?
Where do you draw that line? Right. It's kind
Well,
of
is that
But
the
I can
planning
tell you a
board's
couple
call?
feet. I'm sorry?
Is that the planning board's call? Should we be just looking at what it actually should be? And if they've built something already in place.
And it's
I'm
not
sorry,
conforming
it's
or
not right, but
illegal.
it's not our decision to say yes, tear it down, or no, go with it.
Well,
Should
you are.
go either go to the courts or go to the appeals or
Effectively
go
you
someplace
are.
else.
Effectively you are, but your decision is just where is greatest practical extent relocation.
it's practical. So what's where?
Right.
So that's
how do you
open for
define- how do you
interpretation.
define
So
practical?
if you say it's
That's where it gets scary.
If you say it's-
Yeah, because we're not a quasi board. I mean, we're
no, but I'm just
we
saying.
got the regulations that we're
Right.
supposed to be sticking.
But if we're only
With
off by a
common
couple
sense
feet,
too, I
right?
realize.
If we're only off by a couple feet, I don't think anybody would disagree.
Well, every
Right.
lot's gonna be,
But-
it's gonna be a different situation no matter where
It
you
is,
are.
but what if it should have moved back 20 feet further?
Which is it.
Then
Where-
your
where you
decision
draw the
is
line.
not. You have to you have to remove your foundation. We're just telling you where relocation to meet the setback is to the greatest practical extent, and then it's on the CEO and probably guys like Chip on the select board to figure out. All right, that's the decision. We're firing up the enforcement machine.
So
and-
do they get a permit from them at that time though? Don't they? I
with
mean,
planning board approval, yep, for
so
low
that in that case
relocation
they
at that
deny
point.
it. Or if it was an after the fact, or if it's already in it, and make them move it. I mean,
Or you could approve it with a condition.
It's not really, well,
so
I
they're
guess,
saying if they want to do it here, and they're saying no, you need to do it here, and they don't want to go with it, then it's a
then it would
denial.
be a denial,
Yeah.
yeah,
And then they go to appeals board.
right.
Okay.
And you could say denial, greatest
Because-
practical extent relocation should be 68 feet from the water instead of 48 feet from the water.
And how do they,
Right.
where do they, like on a river, like say the Salmon Falls, where there's a lot more water in there this year than there has been the past 5 years, where would they consider the water line?
Yeah, good question. That can change to a degree, but it's the normal high water line, okay? It's the emphasis on the normal high water line. Okay, which
Like
is
say we went out to a site, how would we know that though, if we was doing
Yeah.
a site, determination, if it was, if it was really close, how would we determine that? Is
well, they
there
would have a
certain,
surveyor. By the time it gets to you, they should have had a survey done.
okay,
The surveyor should be well versed in shoreland zoning and be able to know the definition of normal high water line says that line which is apparent from visible markings, changes in the character of soils due to prolonged action of the water or changes in vegetation, and which distinguishes between predominantly aquatic and predominantly terrestrial. They should know that definition.
yeah, just cause
Yeah,
like
yeah.
with Salmon Falls,
So we have
the
a
dam was out for so long. The dam was out for a good, dozen years, so the water
Yeah.
was way down. Now they put the dam back in. The water's up, probably at least 8 to 10 feet higher than it's been in a long time.
Will they
Just
change
this
that?
year it went in.
Yeah, just
Oh, it
this
did?
year. Yeah, last summer you could have walked across that river without barely getting wet.
Yeah. So I mean, you have to use or really
Yeah.
it's going to be decided before it gets to you. You can question it if you're out there seeing it at the old high water line before the dam was fixed. Well, wait a minute. You're out doing your site walking. You say, no. It's somewhere up in here.
Right.
And you can either decide as a board, we're going to call it here, have your surveyor come back out and fix this, or you can say we're going to deny it on the basis that your numbers are wrong. Come back in, or we'll give you an opportunity to come in next month with correct numbers.
On shoreline zoning stuff, when they ask when the applicant, when the permits and stuff ask for a site plan and all this, you're talking about having a surveyor. Yet I see a lot of these things is hand drawn by the
Yeah.
applicant.
Right.
There's no surveyor, there's no.
Right.
Is there anything in the ordinance that requires surveying?
No,
I didn't think so.
no, not necessarily. So the further towards the coast you get,
The more rigid.
you have to.
Yes.
Towns just require. I mean, I'm not saying it's just limited to the city folks. A lot of towns anywhere in the state require a surveyed site plan. Case in point, I'll get to you in just a sec, Deb. Case in point, there was an application on my desk that I'm looking at right now up in the town of Porter, where the applicant had a site plan like this. The water's down here, down at the bottom. And they show the house down here, the existing house, and they're actually seeking a variance for a shed, but there's an existing shed down here that, based on our review of aerial photo imagery and both Google Earth and our GIS mapping system, that this shed didn't exist until well after the standards took effect. So anyway, they're proposing to build a new shed where this one is and relocate this shed over here. I mean, this is what's shown on their site plan, way down here. All right, and so first issue is, well, that looks to be an illegal shed in the first place. Secondly, the shed, accessory structure, variance, undue hardship, looking at the Board of Appeals. You can't justify that because it's an accessory structure. It's property already yields a reasonable return. You guys don't want to know about that stuff.
No.
But anyway, so I talked to the landowner. I said, look, you can, this likely illegal shed that the town needs to do a little digging around looking at, that can probably be just relocated on the land back to 100 feet back here. Well, I can't go back to 100 feet because I'd be on somebody else's land. And I said, well, I'm looking at your plan and you have everything down here and you show this lot line way back to here. It looks like it's 300 feet away. He goes, oh, well, that's not really to scale. And that's a problem we run into.
That's well drawn.
Yeah, that's a problem we run into with these things. And this is why you require, you don't have to, a surveyed site plan. Showing property boundaries. I want to see the HHE 200 for the existing system. I want to know how old it is by looking at that. Is it 2 years old? So, all right, we don't have to worry about future soils for a septic system. I mean, you're looking at professionally prepared documents. If you do accept these hand-drawn sketches, just be very careful with your site walk, out on the site walk. Mr. or Ms. Property Owner, where is your property pin? Exactly. I want to see your property pin back there and over there,
So is that something that we can amend the shoreline zoning ordinance to require that?
Absolutely. Yeah. But is it necessary in every case? I don't know. So you just weigh that. If it's a
Yeah, because if you approve it and put it in there, then it applies across the board. Every application that comes through absolutely has to have a surveyed site plan.
I don't like to spend my own money for stuff I don't feel like I need to spend money on, or somebody else thinks I need to spend money and I don't. I certainly feel the same about other people. So, maybe 20% of the plans you don't need that. So just consider that.
Do they ever put it with code enforcement officer's discretion type of thing?
I'm never getting in there.
How do you?
Yeah, or if they don't submit something, you can look at the town assessor's tax card record, see if they show how big is the lot. You guys do a little bit of legwork.
Yeah.
Well, they told me to wait until identification.
All right, I think we're done. All right.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry, Chip, for interrupting you for 20 minutes now. So here's my question. If the planning board denies, and now they come in front of appeals board, and we're looking, and we can find the hardship, which they don't have to deal with, but we do, and we can find the hardship, and so we approve the variance, do we now kick it back to planning board to relocate vegetation, all that stuff, or do we make that part of our conditions with the variance approval? Because that's been, back and forth, our conversations, which have been
right.
lengthy, but that's part of our concern now,
Yeah.
finding out the legalities of all of this, is that we don't know if they've denied already, they're not comfortable with it. But if we can
Right.
find hardship and we're going to approve, do we then list all of these things in our condition, or do we put in our conditions they have to go back to planning board for more work with, or CEO or DEP? Where do we, how detailed do we get in our conditions with relocation, revegetation,
Yeah,
etc.?
yeah, good question. Any other good questions?
Sorry,
Nice brain.
Yes, I'm looking at answer too.
Alright.
She's gonna tell
Very,
that.
very good question.
That's what you'll tell me, ask the lawyer.
No, very good question. So there's two things to distinguish in our minds tonight, okay? If they're appealing a planning board decision, greatest practical extent relocation, for instance. Now, I don't think I can move back to, 100 feet from the shoreline. I think I can only move back 72 feet. They'll appeal that to you guys. That would not be a variance appeal. There are two types of appeals. That would be an administrative appeal.
Right.
And you'd have to make a finding that the planning board erred in order to overturn that, and then that would send it back to the planning board.
And then if they go back to them for all the
Right.
conditions.
Now, if they say, okay,
Just hold on to
Yep,
that for
sure.
a second. If we said we felt the planning board was mistaken and we kick it back to the planning board, are we asking them for a redetermination? Or are we
Effectively.
saying, we think you erred and you now must help these people? I mean, I don't want to, I think
Yeah.
it's just like you would ask appeals for a redetermination if we
Right.
granted the variance. That's what we do now with planning board, is ask for the
Where do you,
redetermination,
where do you
correct?
break the gridlock? 'Cause what happens if the planning board says,
Right,
no,
they-
we're
That's
right.
what, yeah, that's what she's
Kind of in a
asking.
loop, a loop.
yeah, then I think in that case, well, so I don't think you have to actually write out on your decision, planning board shall reconsider this. By default, if you guys say, oh, yeah, we disagree with the decision, we feel it should be 72 feet, then it by default, and this is getting into municipal law a little bit, but my
Right.
understanding is it then goes back to the planning board for
Wait.
consideration.
For, like you would,
Reconsideration.
you would ask appeals to reconsider if you had recommended not to approve and we approved, you come back to us and ask for reconsideration, right?
Yes, although I'm saying that I'm almost thinking that a town attorney might say, if the planning board said 100 feet and you guys say no, 72 feet, then that might be the end of the story.
72 feet is the answer.
I think it is,
Yeah,
and then the
so-
planning board would have legal rights to
Because they have a,
appeal.
Right, we could change that, I think we could change by variance to allow 72 feet. But my question is actually what happens.
no, it's not a variance because they're allowed, they're allowed to do it anyways.
That would be an administrative appeal.
Oh,
The Board of
administrative appeal.
Appeals would be saying, no, we feel greatest practical extent determination is 72.
72 feet.
Variance
And
is
then
a
that's
whole-
what holds. But then once we make that determination, does it then go back to planning board
Yeah, I'm almost
for
thinking that's not-
revegetation and
Agree.
I don't
Yeah.
think it does.
I almost
And
think
Why would it go back to
who then
planning board?
determines the need for revegetation and all that stuff? That because we
For all these
altered
guidelines.
planning
We
board
said no.
plan, that's on us
That's
now?
what she
What about
said.
the rest
Right,
of the
right,
file?
right.
But
Right, that's what,
who follows?
I mean, I can ask Mary, she's coming on the 13th, I can
Yeah.
ask her, cause maybe that's more of a legal.
Yeah, I think I'd merely speculate, and I think my speculation is biased for the DEP. I think it would be somebody darn well better make them revegetate, but
That's
I'm
what
not
I'm
sure
thinking.
legally what the.
Cause if the
Do
planning
that.
board denied, then they wouldn't have, if they denied based on the 100 feet versus 72 feet, they wouldn't have gone all through that already and decided revegetation and slow.
Well, they can say 72 feet,
there would have been
but
some
still
component.
following, because he's 72 feet, but still following all the guidelines of shoreline zoning.
Right, for revegetation.
For everything. I mean,
That could be a
for
condition of the
erosion,
Board of
for
Appeals.
everything. I mean,
So could we kick it back to the plan, say that we grant for the 72 feet and kick it back to planning board to make a decision on the revegetation? Say they have to revegetate by working with the planning board?
They have to anyways.
I understand that, but it has to be written once we change that plan, Chip, it has to be written. So who do we kick them back to? Do we then responsible for
I think you'd have to
revegetation?
Yeah.
Or do we say working with DEP on revegetation? Or do we
No.
say, I'm sending it right to you, Mike. Or do we say go back and work with the planning board on revegetation?
I think it would be just a condition of on the Board of Appeals decision to say, any revegetation must comply with the ordinance.
Cause they have to follow the ordinance anyway, regardless.
Right.
So
The buck stops with them,
with the
clearly.
conditions, like we would have to do, okay, we're gonna improve it with the 72 feet, but you still have to do this condition, you have to meet that, and then you have to meet this.
You have to follow the ordinance.
And then it would be code enforcement's job to watch and make sure that they're revegetating correctly, is it?
Yeah, the code enforcement
Because
officer.
then once we've made that decision, then it kicks back to codes to make sure that they're following the ordinance?
You're just
Well,
trying to
Brian
kick everything
asked-
back to somebody else.
Yes, we
Love
are.
it.
Passing it all the way.
Yeah.
Well, I just didn't think it was my. Hey, if you want me to be queen, I will gladly put on that crown. But I'm just trying to make sure I don't overstep the queendom.
So, Brian had asked if the planning board had ever, at any time, given the authority to the code enforcement officer to make a decision on the best placement is where to put it. So, if we do that, then we can just leave it all to the code enforcement officer.
We'll all give it over to him.
Everybody.
No wonder you can't hire a code enforcement officer.
But that,
If
can that
they're
go
doing
against?
the best placement,
There would
so
still
are we
be.
charging them with that? Like we would charge a code enforcement officer? I mean,
Yeah, so that would be, so if that's given to that authority's not, the ordinance specifies that is for code enforcement officer, not the planning board, then it just means these guys have to deal with that. But the CEO can still make a decision and the landowner not like it, and then appeal the CEO's decision to the Board of Appeals.
so we don't have to charge them with anything. We don't have to say, okay, you are allowed to do this for order of the planning board.
Well, no, because it's by ordinance.
Right.
Right in the ordinance. Now, regarding this whole, do we give that authority to the CEO or not? DEP has two thoughts on that. It's never cut and dry, I'm sorry, but the first thought is, CEOs attend our workshops, where we go over all this stuff. They attend our trainings. I have phone conversations with code enforcement officers every single day of the year, except for Christmas, New Year's, and Labor Day. So I'm having these conversations with them. I'm out on site with code enforcement officers. Hey, Mike, what do you think greatest practical extent is? Well, let's look at the site conditions, look at the site plan. We're going through this whole thing that we've just been through about relocation. We can do it fairly quickly because we're more familiar with the standards at this point. You guys will come to love them, embrace these standards soon enough. But
Lies, all lies, I don't believe it.
but so we can do this, relatively quickly and say, well, it could be here, roughly right back in here. So a code enforcement officer should have more expertise, more knowledge about what this greatest practical extent relocation is, theoretically. All right, but they're also one person.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay,
That's leaving it up to the
board.
discretion of one person.
Right.
Because practical is open to
Right.
opinion versus
A
many
greater.
of us
Yep. But
holding
that's
a vote.
that in my mind is key. I think that offsets maybe a little less experience with those sets of standards than the one person has. That's offset by having, a group of very capable readers. Okay, here are the standards. Here's what it means. We've been to a sidewalk. We see how it. We may miss it a little bit, but collectively, we think we can make a better decision. All right. The other part, and I don't like to say this, but I can tell you one town near where I'm going tomorrow to meet with a group. If he likes you, I hate to say it in 2017, but if you don't tick him off, he likes you, then he flexes a bit too much.
Or if he's scared of you.
If
Imagine that.
he doesn't like you,
Forget it.
you're kind of hosed, and I don't like that. Again, that's one person. If one person on this planning board has feelings like that, it's offset by the rest of the board.
Balanced out.
What's that?
It's balanced out.
Yeah, balanced out.
Kind of.
The other
I
thing
think it could
is
be a more fair process by having
A group.
Multiple.
a group.
the other problem with giving it to a code enforcement officer, and DEP would approve the town's ordinance if amended to give that authority to the code enforcement officer. We've done it in other towns. We know the risk. But the other, I think, important risk to consider is some towns have code enforcement officers, be gentle, they're somewhat missing the boat on what the regulations say, might improperly issue permits for things that they shouldn't be issuing for.
That never happens.
No.
But that's not the only thing. I had a code officer that retired in a town. Yes, Lebanon has had some problems. And
Surely you jest.
DEP would not feel comfortable with that individual. Nice enough guy, I'm not. But professionally, he either didn't understand or had a personal bias. I don't know, I don't care. But he messed up pretty significantly on a number of sites, and DEP would not feel comfortable with that CEO being the authority for determining greatest practical extent relocation.
So should we even consider putting it up to vote to be put in our town ordinance, since we currently only have an intern CEO? We don't even have a CEO to defer this responsibility to.
Well, I mean, that's another thing to consider. If you have a lot of high turnover, you look at the past bunch of years. I mean, a lot of towns do, but if you tend to,
Well, half the problem is we don't pay full-time as
Right.
much as, as most towns pay part-time.
Right? He's like, this is not my deal.
Well, that's why I said it, because I knew he was sitting over there, but.
another code enforcement officer that had this authority in a different town, also near where I'm going to be tomorrow, around the Sebago Lake region. He retired a number of years ago. Nice guy, but went out. One of the slides that we had up here tonight showed a picture of a boathouse being rebuilt next to Sebago Lake. And the conversation was, it was a non-conforming structure. It was a boathouse, right? It's not a functionally water-dependent use or structure. So if it's being torn down and rebuilt, it goes through this relocation review. His opinion was, Mike, I just disagree with the law.
Oh, that's cute, darling, but that doesn't matter.
Exactly. And I had hair up until that day.
And then you look at him and say, I disagree with you having this job.
So it's just, I wouldn't want that code officer, if he was still working, as a code officer. So I'm encouraged, DP would encourage, and I would personally encourage planning boards to retain that authority. It doesn't mean planning boards always get it right. I've seen a planning board in this southern part of the state, southern inland part of the state, where I scratch my head. I mentioned it very briefly earlier, where, you got to relocate your house back so you can't even open the door to your garage. You can put a door on the other side of your garage, they said.
Totally makes sense. Very practical. Very practical.
And I just, way overboard the other way. So
You've been reading our cases?
You would never let something like that fly
but so it is something to consider.
Yeah.
forever.
Definitely something to consider, but it's but I just say my recommendation is just kind of cruise with what you have for now, and let's see how code enforcement office type stuff goes here in Lebanon for a while, and see how this greatest practical extent review works for you guys.
I have something to talk to you about if you get a couple minutes.
Sure. Absolutely.
We've been hanging out all
I'm
night.
not sure I want to know. It's coming from code. But yeah, that's I guess that's what I'd suggest is hold on to that authority until you feel like you've been burned. But I don't think you're going to see a lot of these being appealed to the Board of Appeals. But you might. It's all it takes. It could be the very first one you do after this meeting. Somebody doesn't like your decision and they appeal.
The appeals board sounds fun.
Come on.
You can't predict that.
I'll let you be
But
chief.
it's not the norm.
I've already roped it in the
So
song.
talk to me about boat ramps generally.
General terms? So boat ramps fit under that category of piers, docks, wharves, and piers, docks, wharves, bridges, and other structures. that extend over the water or below the normal high water line of a water body. They are functionally water dependent. How does a boat launch? How could a boat launch not be water dependent? So you got to recognize that. So now you have a boat launch, the ramp part in the water, that structure. How are you going to get down to it? And I touched on those the standards for the roads earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Being an exception, right?
yeah, be an exception from the setback. And as odd as it may sound, shoreland zoning, and I'm going to say maybe it's something shoreland zoning is missing. I'm not sure, but I'm a proponent of access to the shoreline, public in particular. Individual landowners every landowner having a boat launch down to the water on their own piece of property. I don't think that's a great fit for shoreline zoning, but shoreline zoning kind of misses this issue and certainly doesn't seem to restrict or limit them, provided you meet certain standards. DEP, under a separate law, whole separate review, has nothing to do with the towns. Don't let it influence you, as I mentioned earlier. Also, under the Natural Resources Protection Act, would have to review the same individual's permit application. And just to give you a sense of where that might be going, this hypothetical application, that regulation looks very closely at alternatives, analysis, avoidance and minimization. So the first thing they look at is, what are your other options? Where's the public boat launch on a water body? What's that?
Where's the closest one?
Exactly. And if it's Sebago Lake and you're down at Sebago Lake Station and the other one's up at the other north end of the lake at the state park, granted there are a few others, but you know what I'm saying? If it's miles, then they may tend to err on the side of the landowner and say, all right, there really isn't anything down here. We'll let you have a minimal boat launch. Or in the case of, let's say, Spalding Pond, just to throw one out, there isn't a public boat launch. So how can DEP deny a boat launch application if there isn't a public boat launch on the lake? So avoidance, minimize, okay, we can make it smaller. We can ensure that it's not going to erode into the lake. These are things the planning board would look at too. It's not going to be a 50-foot wide boat launch. It's going to be, I don't know, 10 feet, 12 feet.
Canoes is about 3.5 feet.
Yeah, but it's the pontoon boat I learned about today.
Yeah.
Pontoon boat. So anyway, so the point is that so let's ignore the DEP process a little bit. But the town, except the DEP, if there is a boat launch around the next cove, DEP is probably going to deny a private boat launch. But the town, shoreline zoning is fairly silent about it. It's functionally water dependent, so functionally water dependent structures are allowed. And then a road is clearly allowed down to it as well. So
as long as it meets the ordinance guidelines,
it's you got a good erosion control plan. It's
then you have to approve.
What's at the shoreline? Is there concrete ramps to hold the soil or something similar, or is it just bare soil? Those are the things you'd focus on to ensure that it's not going to create water quality problems. And then.
Richard, we are concerned with revegetation growth in the shoreline to make sure that the visibility is not compromised.
I would love to see the planning board.
You're his favorite now, Paul.
Some vegetation there. In a hypothetical situation, I've struggled in. I'm dealing with 82 towns worth of stuff. At the same time, I'm dealing with one individual in Lebanon, and he's been nice enough to deal with from my standpoint. Personally, I just we all have personalities that are different, and me included and him included. But we failing to understand what's being communicated with regard to vegetation replanting. We've got more work to do. I saw some photos today of a particular site in this area that just totally missed the mark for vegetation replanting. But if the planning board wanted to add to that and say, okay, we might be able to approve a boat launch for a given site. But gee, you have this open area that needs to be revegetated. It might not hurt to have a nicely prepared revegetation plan up to the edges of this possible boat launch that could be approved. The code enforcement office would ordinarily be hammering away at this as well without a whole lot of involvement from me, but you don't have a code enforcement officer. You have Brian, who's been doing a great job for the few hours a week he has, and he's scrambling trying to do septic inspections, foundation inspection, all this stuff. And that's just the nature of the beast. So if you guys feel it would be appropriate to require some replanting and have a good revegetation plan in there, I think the ordinance allows it and supports that. Yeah, boy. How much can I give you?
Get that ordinance back.
Get more of my cards. No, I'm kidding. But I think it would be. I think the ordinance allows that, and I think it would be welcome relief to have somebody else saying. Of course, the town would have to enforce that if it's not done properly. So
Having it in writing would help.
Yeah.
A lot.
It's not their variance, just saying.
So, but boat launches in general, we don't advertise to property owners that they're
No,
allowed
you wanna
to
put a
have
boat launch in? We're totally down with that.
Yeah. There's another one, the private boat launch on the cove right behind this particular property. You might remember Ron Wright's property. Cutting violation. I went to court. The town took him to court. There's some shortcomings with the court process and resulted in a lawn, but he was able to keep, I think, like a 10-foot wide section of his property from being revegetated so that he could launch a boat because there was no public boat launch. I think it's grassed over. I don't think he constructed anything, but I'm not sure. So.
It's true because we require a meandering path, so you can't see down the path and things along.
Meandering?
Yeah. But a boat launch is going straight through.
Right.
It's like
Well,
this row here and then we have this row here. It's like
right.
okay.
And this is something that DEP's Shoreland, the three of us in the Shoreland zoning unit have talked about a little bit. For us to make any changes, it's at the very least rulemaking, if not possibly going to legislature for a law change. And we're talking 5 years out before all those things happen. Rulemaking we could do inside of a year probably, but I don't think we're ready to do that because we don't do just one thing. Give us a whole bunch of things that needs to change, and then we'll go in and fix it all at once.
Well, you can't make a boat ramp meander.
Yeah.
Can you imagine trying to back a boat down there?
It'd be interesting.
It'd be hard enough
You know,
driving
your
it down.
skills, your backup skills, that's for sure.
Yeah, but in the meantime, if the town wanted to somehow limit or restrict or prohibit private boat launches, I just don't know that you want to go. Well, you might want to go down that road. Yeah, maybe not. I mean, there are boats in the ponds, and there's no public boat launch. People, neighbors. There are some neighbors that like neighbors down there in some of these places, certainly. And hey, I've got this old slip that I've used just to back over the side of the lawn and put my boat in for the last 48 years. I've let all my neighbors around here do that too, and that's how they're getting in there, and it's worked. It's just then somebody comes along and it's not well liked, and that's you can't use it.
Burn cigarettes up through the middle of it.
Right.
Yeah. But especially where there's no public boat launch on a couple of these ponds in town, I don't know. Prohibiting might be a little strong, but that's just my opinion. I should shut up about that, but you guys can certainly mull it over.
Boy, that was a good little seed planting expedition.
No, I leave it up to you guys, but I just I don't know. These regulations, I mean, yes, I kind of kid around about being the cold-hearted regulator and the cold-hearted regulation, And that's who we have to be. It's not who we are. It's our job. These are very restrictive as it is. They do a lot to restrict people's use of the land as it is.
So why make it more restrictive?
And I think we need to recognize that, yeah, we are landowners. We are paying, you hear it all the time. I'm paying taxes on that. Well, we are. So we should have rights. Is this being recorded?
Yes.
That's all right. No, I think that's a DEP position. You know, absolutely. It's been for years. We do have rights, and it's just how it is. So. But
then you get into
that's
that things like who determines that? Well, I have rights, and they did this, so why can't I do that, and blah, 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 and
right,
we've already done this, so why can't we do a little bit more, and it just snowballs.
right.
So it's like if you're not consistent, it goes.
Consistency is the toughest thing.
We have turnover.
Yeah. It's the toughest thing too when you're dealing with different applications, different properties, and you're being 100% consistent and it just doesn't look like it. There are two properties Chip and I have been talking about down on Sewell Shores. You guys all know about them, I'm sure. One house here and another house here, new, too close to the shoreline. You know the story behind them. And on the day of discovery, if you will, September 18th, when I inspected the sites with a former code enforcement officer.
Day that will go down in infamy.
Yeah,
Yes.
one was already framed up, roof was on, and the other one's just a footing. This guy, who just got a jump start on his, secured his vested rights or what have you, that it's a much harder sell to say you gotta get it out of there legally. Whereas the one with just the footing, yeah, the attorney types are saying, no vested rights or, you know, no rights to be able to keep
Yeah, I'm
it.
telling you, it would not be pretty. Yeah, no.
Understand he, well, yeah, but that's,
It'll be even better when, well, now it's fully up.
yeah.
Yeah, because, and
After it's done-
especially
after it's done
because
before.
now I'm hearing from people in that area, well, it all depends on how fast we can get it up without getting caught. You know, we don't have to go through all this stuff. If we can get it up fast and not get caught,
You know,
and that's the
So
thing
what
with
kind of
not
precedent
enforcing.
is that setting?
Because it's not,
What
because
precedent
it's
is
not being enforced,
Well,
they
it's
all
not
are now
enforced.
saying, we gotta do this fast
there
instead
won't
of
be any
doing
more
it
of those
right.
permits being issued.
What if they were issued a permit and they started, and then they were told you can't go any further?
And then they continued anyway.
Right, correct.
They heard that from the town and heard that directly from me sitting in my office in Portland. You cannot violate a stop work order. Yeah, the answer was the date of the stop work order. When you're issued that, what existed on that site is what it's based on. Anything further doesn't give you any.
So
Now,
basically,
I'm not
you
an
kind of
attorney,
take
but
pictures the
it's-
date that you
Oh.
posted.
It's been photographed, well photographed.
So even if they continue to do work, it doesn't go in their favor. They can get it framed and under roof, and that won't.
Well, we'll probably be finding out.
We'll be fine.
Anybody can hire a really good attorney and fight however they want to fight. We'll see how it plays
Depends
out.
how much money they wanna spend, I guess.
Right?
But who has the more solid case? You know,
Yeah.
I think we've had that
Who has the
discussion.
most money?
So if they didn't
And
have
that's
to
just
stop
how much
work
the
order,
town has to spend.
then that turns into that situation that you just talked about.
Right, right. If they had a verbal, and I've run into this in another town where an illegal patio was constructed. I was on site when they were prepping the site. I was on site with a code enforcement officer, and I knew what they were building, and I said, "Whoa, you know, is this part of the permit?" "Oh, I think we have all the permits for everything," said the contractor. Looked at the code officer. "Did they have a permit specifically for this new patio?" "No, that was never part of the permit." "No, well, we're just replacing something that used to be there." "Well, was it legally existing?"
Was it dirt?
"Well, it was there.
Imagination.
It wasn't legally existing." And this is actually in the court process right now. And it wasn't legally existing. And anyway, so they ended up just going ahead and course, and building it and putting a nice hot tub on it and doing this and that, but it's too close to the lake, all, you know, that whole game. And, yeah, so it's just, I verbally told him, the code enforcement officer verbally told him, quit it. And, you know, I had the discussion with the CEO. You think you ought to put a stop work order on that? Oh, I don't know. He's a good fellow. And he didn't. And when we were going through mediation, the retired judge mediator said, "But you didn't put a stop work order on it, did you?" I don't have the authority to it. The town has that authority. And I said, looked at the CEO. Yeah, how about that?
They're good friends.
You know, and that didn't help our case. But mediation's off the table now. They didn't want to play ball, so we'll see what the regular judge says. And
We'll see.
we'll see. All about a stupid patio. All about a patio.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments? You know, my last comment is just this. You're gonna, you know, you may be hopefully not overwhelmed tonight, but you'll feel like, man, am I gonna remember all this when the next application comes in? I don't know. You may or may not. If you don't and you have questions, just give me a call.
No.
You know how to get in touch with me. Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks again for inviting us down to chat.